Rightio, thank you for coming along, everyone. My name is Matthew Dickerson. APA's asked me to come along tonight just to facilitate. I've got no interest in the actual pipeline or anything in particular. Really, my job is to come along and chair a meeting, and I suppose I'm going to draw on my 5 years as Mayor of Dubbo in that, because you had to chair a lot of meetings and talk to a lot of groups of people. My idea here really is to make sure that everyone gets to have a say. I'm a complete naive person in terms of the pipeline or in terms of CSG. I know literally nothing about those things. My job is not to know about those, because we've got a number of experts which I'll introduce in a moment. My job is really to make sure that everyone gets to have their say, and so that's going to be my objective for the evening, is to make sure everyone can have their say, get their thoughts heard, get questions answered. If we can answer them here on the spot, the APA reps will answer them here on the spot, or if not, they'll make a commitment to answer those within a 2-week time frame. John Medcalf, the Mayor of Lachlan, was going to come along today. Unfortunately, he got delayed, so he did ask me to put in an apology for him, but John was certainly keen to come along. Obviously, it affects things that happen in his shire, but John certainly sends his thoughts along to have an effective and productive meeting. Again, not that that's condoning what's happening or against what's happening. He just thinks it's good to have a good meeting here. And we've also got to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're all meeting on today. What I'll do first of all is I'll just introduce Jim Felso, who's an APA representative. He's the project manager for the pipeline that's going from Narrabri down through to the Moomba City pipeline. And I'll just ask Jim, if he can, just to introduce his fellow APA board members, or sorry, not board members, representatives. And then we'll go in and I'll talk a little bit more, and then we'll get into a brief presentation. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Matthew. And hello again to those of you that I've met before. Jim Felso, as Matthew mentioned, I'm the project manager for this phase of the Western Slopes Pipeline project on behalf of APA. I'll point out a few people that are in the room from APA so that everyone's aware who they are. Paul Maloney on my right is our General Manager of Infrastructure Planning and Protection. So Paul's got responsibility within APA for seeking approval for new projects that are in the development phase. Tom Smith is our land access lead for this phase of the project and coordinates the land access activities that we undertake as part of the project. And Kevin Lester is also in the room. Kevin Lester is our Group Executive for Infrastructure Development. And look, Kevin's here to represent the corporate executive within APA. And if there's any questions that the project team can't answer, Kevin may be able to chime in as well. So Kevin's here, and he'll be here afterwards, and happy to have a chat to anyone. The other people, John Wood's also in the room. John Wood's our land access officer based in this southern portion of the pipeline. Spends majority of his time in Warren, and a number of you probably have met with him in the past. So I'll hand back to Matthew quickly. That's who we are. Format of today, we'll do a brief presentation, but really focuses on providing you an opportunity to ask questions of us, and hopefully we can give you the answers you're looking for.
Thank you, Jim. So just brief housekeeping. Toilets, you probably know them better than I do, out the back door and out the side, and toilets are also inside here. If there's an emergency, just run. Okay, you can find the exit, I'm sure, and I'm sure you'll be able to find your way out of here, but I think you've got to say those things to cover off. And again, what I want is just to make sure we've got a productive meeting. There'll be a presentation that Jim and Paul will run through to give an overview. You're probably familiar with most of the information that's in there, but I thought it was important just to make sure we get to make sure all those facts are covered, and to see that all of those baselines are covered. If anyone wants to ask a question at any point during the presentation, just stick your hand up. I'll bring a microphone over to you. I would welcome questions through the presentation, welcome questions after the presentation. You don't have to wait till it's finished. Some questions might be answered as part of the presentation, but what I'm really trying to achieve here is a good open conduit. So don't feel like you've got to wait till the end. Don't feel like you've got to stay quiet. Just stick your hand up and I'll bring a microphone over. Jim will have the other microphone and we'll get some information flowing through. But yeah, look, again, I want to make sure we've just got a good, open, productive meeting, and I think we'll learn a lot, and certainly I'll learn a lot about what's happening in our region. So Jim, I'll hand over to you to go through the presentation, and this will only take about 20 minutes to give a quick overview, and then we'll get into some more Q&A. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Matthew. So Paul's actually going to start, so I'll hand the mic straight to him.
Thanks everyone, and thanks for taking the time to come along. Look, I haven't got a huge amount to cover front up because, as Matthew said, a lot of this is about hearing from yourselves and answering questions, but I thought it useful that everyone at least knows who APA is and where we sit in the business world. So, sorry, that better? Yeah. Good. Okay, so APA is a Australian Stock Exchange listed energy infrastructure company. Its core business is to own and operate energy infrastructure. A big part of that portfolio of assets is gas pipelines. We operate nationally. I believe, behind you you'll see a map That map there represents the assets APA owns. We have a lot of pipelines that we own and operate, mainly transmission pipelines like the one we're talking about here today. But we also operate network pipelines, smaller pressure, those sort of pipelines that go up streets and service individual houses and the like. We operate a number of those sorts of pipelines on behalf of others. We've got a growing business in generation, so we have gas-fired power stations, solar farms, wind farms, and a number of those still under development. And we also work in the area of gas processing facilities, so we operate facilities that process gas for third parties. About 1,600 people, offices all around Australia, and as you can imagine, one of the features of APA with assets spreading out like they do across that map. We have people based in Cobar, we've got Cobar representation here today, all sorts of regional towns, but our biggest centres are Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Perth. That's probably where the largest sort of office presences are. So that's who we are. I guess one of the features of APA is we're a big business, we cover a lot of territory. We own a lot of the assets that provide energy to people around Australia, but we're not often particularly well known because we're at that sort of wholesale end of the business or operating assets. So quite often the first time people say they know of APA is when they say their super fund owns APA shares and the like. So we're not particularly well known, but we're certainly pleased to be able to be here today to let you find out more about us and what our project's about. So any questions about APA before I hand over to Jim? Thanks, Jim. Oh, sorry. I add another slide. Okay, so just a quick overview of Western Slopes Pipeline Project. We're proposing a 460 kilometre or thereabouts buried gas pipeline between Santos's Narrabri project and connecting into the Moomba-Sydney pipeline. Moomba-Sydney pipeline is one of the pipelines you would have seen on the map previously, and it's owned by APA. So the pipeline we're talking about is somewhere between 400 and 450 millimetres in diameter and buried close to a metre under the ground. Just one of the things I thought might be useful here today, just to put into perspective, that's a piece of pipe at the smaller end of the scale I just spoke of.
Paul, I'll use the microphone. I know we can probably hear you, but just so everyone else in the room can hear. Thank you. And just say your name before you ask a question.
Sorry, Paul, I'm Melinda Mills, a landowner in Tottenham, and I'm a little bit confused. You say the pipeline's buried to minimum depth of 900 mil. Why did you submit in your government submission that it could be a minimum of 750 mil?
Look, I think that's, it's a good question. The Australian standard calls for a minimum of 750, so that is the absolute minimum that you can bury a pipeline such as this. We've elected, and in the bulk of our literature, other than perhaps that first document, we are talking 900 millimetres. I think it's important to recognise as well too that the Australian standard that we designed to requires us to bury at a suitable depth for the risk. Or the perceived risk that might occur to the pipeline. So in some areas it might be 1.2 metres, 1.5 metres or even deeper. But if landowners are looking for comfort around depth within their property that meets their needs for property operation, agricultural activities, that's the sort of thing we're prepared to agree and document in writing with individual landowners.
That's right, Melinda. Thank you. I'll just duck down the back here, Paul.
Rosalie Hunt, landowner, mother of a project manager. I'd like to know from Jim Kelso, with respect to the contract that you're working under, and we all know that project managers' aim in life is to minimise costs and expedite production. How can we be reassured when we have seen no writing to assure us of these depths in your submission to the government? The contract will, I'd imagine, follow the submission. Once the government ticks that off, how can you give us assurance? You say you will do it in writing. Why haven't you done it? This process has been going on for a long time.
Look, I may just have a first crack at that, and if there's more that Jim needs to add. Importantly, we can't design a pipeline until we know exactly where it's going to go. The pipeline will have a final design. When it comes to individual property owners, if it's important to them to have a specific depth in their property due to their land use, we will agree those. We are not at the stage of having anyone asked us to, confirm in writing particular depths. But we can guarantee you that if individual landowners entering into agreements with APA, if they need depth as a condition of those agreements, we will do those, and they will be in writing. The pipeline design will not be finished for probably a year or so. The broad concepts of the design are well understood because it will match the Australian standard, but the specifics of every metre of the pipeline is yet to be resolved.
Thanks, Paul. I'll let Paul continue on.
Okay, look, not a huge amount of other details. Obviously, that is high-strength steel. After the event, if anyone wants to come and have a look at the steel, as I say, that's broadly representative of the type of pipeline we're talking about. It's very strong. It's capable of, holding significant pressure. Just in terms of what the pipeline can achieve, and probably a lot of people won't necessarily understand what 200 terajoules per day means, but that's a large quantity of gas. And to put it into the context, that's around 50% of the daily use of natural gas by New South Wales at the moment. So a heck of a lot of gas can fit through a pipeline of that size. We're proposing to locate that pipeline within generally a 30 metre wide easement, and a 30 metre wide easement is of adequate width to have some controls over what the landowner can do there, and is adequate to enable proper soils management during construction. So we're looking at a 30 metre wide easement for a pipeline of that diameter. It won't sit right in the middle of that easement, it'll sit slightly off to one side. Sorry, I think there were some questions. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just want to let Paul finish that one slide, and then I'll come back to you and then over to this young lady over there. Thank you.
No worries. So, Paul, why have you got a 30 metre easement? So, obviously the Moomba pipeline is a much bigger pipeline, and they've only got a 20 metre easement. Why have you got a 30 metre easement?
Yeah, okay, I guess one of probably the thing that takes the most careful management in building a pipeline is soils management. And I probably speaking to people who know an awful lot more about it than I, but topsoil management in particular. So when you're talking about stripping topsoil off to one side so it's not lost or mixed with subsoils, you need to be able to push that off to one side. Then you need to be able to dig a trench, and the deeper the trench is, the more spoil comes out of that trench. The other thing that influences that these days is we use what are called padding machines, which will travel across the spoil and shake out the stones to make sure that the pipeline is sitting in clean material. So history has shown that extra bit of dimension enables topsoil separation to be maintained, so it gives a much better outcome. Now again, if there are specific locations where the 30 metres causes great impact to a landowner, we're happy to negotiate about those. But 30 metres works very well. Very large diameter contemporary pipelines in some instances have been as high as 35. But yeah, historically they were narrower. Unfortunately, we didn't manage soils as well as we need to and should do these days.
So Paul, just to help with my knowledge, sorry, I'm over this side now. When you talk about the Moomba Sydney pipeline, approximately when was that pipeline built?
Look, 1974, I think, is my recollection, so a long while ago.
Yeah, right. Okay, so things have, what you're saying is things have changed in that time.
Yes, and look, and the other thing to remember is, and I wasn't there, I was in shorts at that time, but, and we'll often still to this very day, where we can't necessarily agree the tenure of 30 metres, that is permanent tenure, we may have a slightly narrower width, but seek a short-term agreement for extra construction width. And that may well have been a feature of the Moomba Sydney pipeline, I couldn't tell you, but the dimension of the land footprint is driven predominantly by management of topsoil. Thanks.
I'll just take to this lady over here.
Hi, Lou Clemson, landholder in the Condo District in the Cobar Shire. My question also relates to the easement of 30 metres. Doesn't this also allow APA the access in future to be able to put a secondary or third pipeline down, similar to what you've done at the Mumbai line? As required, whenever required in the future?
The easement terms that we'll be seeking from landowners will talk of pipes or pipelines. So that's quite right. Each would be a compensatable event in terms of the way the indemnity would read. It would be possible that a pipeline could be replaced. And I think it's important to note that we're talking about a pipeline at the moment that's going to be sized to the maximum of what the Narrabri project is seeking to approve. But I'm not going to sit here and say it's not impossible that would occur. But the terms of how we're seeking an agreement would allow for pipe or pipes. Again, if that becomes a huge sticking point, that's something we're prepared to negotiate about those. The other thing is to note that, sometimes, and we've done this recently, and this piece of pipe I'm pointing to there, when duplication has occurred, sometimes it only happens for a very short length of, for example, this pipeline being 460 kilometres, just to allow for a little bit of extra capacity. And under those circumstances, there's a lot of flexibility as to where that extra looping, as we call it, would occur. But again, if it's a huge issue for people, we're prepared to negotiate about those, but we certainly will have agreements in front of people that talk about any revisiting of the easement, whether it's for maintenance or duplication or whatever, will re-trigger an entire compensation framework around impacts to land and losses of production.
But once the easement's in place and the easement's signed off by the landholder, APA still can come in and run a secondary pipeline or third pipeline there, should it be required. And I mean, APA at the moment, how it's run, I'm talking 10, 20, 30 years down the track, the landholders need to be aware that the easement is allowed for multiple pipelines, not just one.
Look, I think we need to be clear. We're talking about what we may propose. It won't happen to landowners if they don't sign a document that says that. So maybe some landowners will say it only needs to be for one pipeline.
And that's up to individual landholders to say that.
Absolutely.
I'll just make sure we just keep with one at the moment. So you're happy? Right. And can I just ask a question there, Paul, too, in relation to that? If you were going to come and put another pipe in, you don't just come along and start doing things. You've got to go through, let's say you're going to run the same pipeline duplicated, you would have to go through the same process that you're doing now?
Look, and we are talking a long way in the distance, so whatever the government approvals process of the day, we would need to go through that. There'd be extensive consultation with landowners, there'd be a redesign, and as I say, a complete duplication is quite hard to contemplate at the moment. The Mooma-Sydney pipeline was not a duplication of natural gas, it was a new ethane pipeline, and a separate easement, I think, in some areas was actually obtained. Sometimes the existing easement was utilised.
Thanks, Paul.
Paul, that's a load of rubbish. You can't say, I'll just do an individual negotiation with you guy down here and here up here, and they say, oh, yep, you can put a second pipeline in, you can put a second pipeline in. Anyone else along there will stuff you, you're going to get a second pipeline. It's not like you can say, oh, yep, these guys have said, no, we won't have a second pipeline. These guys have said yes. If you're going to put a second pipeline in, everyone gets a second pipeline.
No, I think you need to be careful how you portray that. I was asked a question as to whether will that automatically allow 2 or 3 pipelines? I have said we will propose a document that contemplates pipe or pipelines, and it won't number one more or any, it'll say pipe or pipelines. What I'm trying to convey here is that people's individual needs are negotiated one-on-one. Yes, we would like a set of easement documents that looked identical along the route, but that just doesn't happen these days. People have specific needs, their lawyers have specific drafting requirements, so I'm trying to indicate that we'll be flexible. We would like a easement that says pipe or pipelines. It'll be up to negotiations as to whether that's achieved.
Thanks, Paul. Just duck down the middle of the audience here. Mrs. Mildner.
Thanks. Kate Mildner from Warren. Are you actually, I understand you're actually in negotiation about the easements already. So are you actually informing landholders that they have the right to only demand one pipeline? And are you informing them of their legal right that you will pay for them to have legal consultation on the easement conditions?
I can answer that in 2 parts. One is, firstly, and I need to stress this again, we're only seeking approval from the government for one pipeline at this stage. Negotiations are about to commence.
We haven't put a document in front of anybody.
Yeah.
No, I said we have not put a document in front of anybody, an easement document in front of anybody at this point in time. Am I right in saying that, Tom? Okay.
Yeah.
Just in case you couldn't hear that.
Sorry, I think there was a second part of your question I wouldn't mind answering first.
I'll go back one step there, sorry. Just because Jim hasn't got a mic, Jim said there are...
Look, just to be really clear, in terms of commencement of easement negotiations, we've said in a number of forums that we are imminently going to commence easement negotiations with a number of landowners. We have not at this point in time put a formal offer for an easement negotiation in front of any landowner.
Thank you. So I'll
Sorry,
let Paul...
There was a second question.
Yeah, sorry, Paul. I'll just...
there.
The gentleman, I'll wait till Kate's answer. The questions are answered first.
Sorry, I actually read that it said currently you're on your website.
If it does, it's a typo. It should say that we're... I don't believe that it does. I'm happy to have a look afterwards, and if it does say that, I apologise, but we have not commenced any negotiations with any landowner.
We need to believe.
Okay, sorry, Paul, if you want to just keep answering Kate's question for me, please. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, no, I think what it says on the website is we're currently commencing these negotiations, as in we're preparing for and getting to start. I don't have it in front of me. I'm happy to be corrected on what it says.
Yeah, sorry.
There was a second
Yeah,
part
Paul,
to that
yep,
question.
so I'll answer that second part of Kate's question.
I think to paraphrase you asked about legal rights and offering to pay. The simple answer to that is landowners will be offered the opportunity, funded by APA, for them to seek independent legal advice and, where necessary, for example, valuation advice.
Do they have to read that on the website, or are you actually telling them that?
That will be explained when people have meetings around proposed easement documentation.
And Paul, I would also think that the idea of attending meetings like this is so that people like Kate can ask those questions and people then are more aware of that process as you go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's very standard practice these days. It would be inappropriate to put a document in front of someone and not allow them to get the lawyer of their choice to review the suitability of the document.
And Paul, the lawyer, so let's say Kate gets a lawyer to get some advice. Does Kate cover the costs of that legal advice, or does APA cover the cost of that?
Look, I mean, we can work that either way. I mean, typically we're happy to receive a note from the nominated lawyer as to what they think they need to spend on the task. We can either pay them, or the landowner can pay them, and we can reimburse them.
Thank you. I'll just go down the back here first before I've got a couple more up the front there.
Tony Van Liebeck from Warren. My question would be, with the easements, if an easement is rejected and you don't want it, are you making landholders aware that you are able, that easement stays alive and you are able to use it in the future? Anyone?
In short, yes, but I think the important point goes back to what we just spoke of there. Landowners don't need to believe what we say about that. They can work with their lawyer to make sure that they have fully explained to them the ramifications of any documents we put in front of them.
Thanks, Paul. I'll just jump here.
Yeah, Tom Walker. At the last CCC committee meeting, Jim, you would be aware, you mentioned yourself that you were in negotiations with landholders already.
Regarding the position of the pipeline. So, Tom, we've been talking to a number of landowners for a very long time, best part of 12 months, about the position of the pipeline within their property, preferred changes to the alignment. I can absolutely 100% say there is not one landowner that I've put an easement document in front of and said this is what we would like to propose as an agreement with you.
What I was about to say, in relation to that meeting, it was a rather contentious thing that not many people thought was a good idea. You said there are already financial inducements being offered to people, and that money would be refundable if the pipeline did not go ahead.
So again, that payment would be made, it's an option payment, it would be made if somebody signs an agreement. It hasn't been offered to anyone yet, and it hasn't been paid to anyone yet. But if we put an easement agreement in front of someone, part of the structure of that document is for entering into that agreement, you are paid an option payment.
Well, that certainly wasn't made clear at that meeting, because as you know, it was rather contentious because people could not understand how you could be offering people money for that, and yet at the same time the pipeline may not have gone ahead. And you said, okay, well, it was able to be refunded if it didn't go ahead, or they got to keep the money, I'm sorry?
That's correct.
If it didn't go ahead. But by the same token, that easement would still be there, even if the money, is that correct or not correct?
No, that's not correct, Tom. To explain the structure of the agreement, and there is a slide on this in the slide pack, but I'll explain it now. The agreement that we will be seeking from people will be an agreement with a term within which APA can obtain an easement. So it's effectively an agreement to obtain an easement at a future date, which is why the term option agreement. It's an option over the land to obtain an easement at a future date. And that's why we pay a fee because you're entering into an encumbrance for that period of time upon your land. And that fee is to compensate you for that. It's not the full compensation that you would receive if the easement goes ahead at a later date.
Can I ask then, I think people in this room need to be aware that we're not talking about chicken feed here, it's a substantial fee that you are offering now just for an option. Has that already been put to people at this point in time?
Absolutely not.
So why was it brought up at the last meeting?
Because we're in the process of preparing to start those easement negotiations in the very near future. I think our land access team have meetings planned for the next 2 weeks where they'll be commencing those negotiations with people. Will they have spoken about the concept of that's how it would be structured? Yes, but have we made an offer to anyone? Absolutely not.
Thanks, Jim. I'll just jump to this gentleman in the front.
Yeah, my name's Brian Plummer. I'm a landholder west of Tottenham that's got some properties that APA thought they were putting a pipeline through previously. I might be a bit steady being out around that Five Ways area, but I'm not real clear where you are with the easements. I have an email from you guys. For your information, APA proposes to seek an agreement with you and other landholders for a future easement, and there will be a non-refundable payment when that is signed. While we have not yet discussed final compensation for the proposed easement with you, we anticipate that an easement payment across all your blocks could be in the region of $150,000. This figure is provided as a guide. Realistically, no. I feel pretty insulted by that actually, because to me that's totally discriminatory across our community, because no one else in the Tottenham region that I've come across yet has had an offer made like that. So I suppose I'm just the weak target that I'm supposed to fold, take the cash and sit at home. But from a proposal to have frank, open community consultation on your behalf as APA's direction, this absolutely stinks, because it's just an open attempt to divide the community, split, divide and conquer. Yep. And we've been there for over a decade of native vegetation, 2 decades if you really want to be honest about it. And it just sucks, boys. It's another example. I'm yet to see an example you blokes can lie straight in bed, and I'm sorry to be sound offensive there, but that's where it's at.
So, Brian, the only thing I can say to that is that I'm unaware of that. I'm not doubting that it exists. I'm not doubting that it exists. I'm happy to have a chat to you about it and the context of it.
Anyway, just there's no point yelling out. We've had a valid question from Brian. I'd like to let Jim answer that, and we can all get a chance to have a say, but it's not going to achieve anything by just yelling out things, please.
Look, all I can suggest that is, it's an outline of the concept of an agreement that would be proposed. It's not a formal offer. It's not a written agreement with the deed that we are going to be seeking. There's no easement terms attached to it proposed. It's a concept of the structure of what we would be seeking from Brian in the future.
Right, thanks, Jim. Now, I'm happy to keep taking questions. That's not a problem. There's still a few more slides to go through. If you want to keep going through those, because some of the questions may be answered, I'm happy to get back to the slides. I'm happy to just keep taking questions. It's in your hands. But would you rather us get back and keep going through the slide, or are you happy to just keep asking questions now? Keep asking questions, right, that's fine. I'll just go back before I jump to you, sir. The lady behind you just she had a hand up just a minute ago. So I'm not sure if you still want to ask a question or yours is, yep.
This is a two-pronged question. Can you define the use within your easement? What are you defining the use as? Is it access, transport, exploration, maintenance, further pipelines? What's your definition of use in your easement documents?
So in the easement document, which will be presented in the future, and there is, like Paul said, the opportunity to have that full document reviewed by your lawyer at our cost. But the broad definition is the construction, maintenance, operation of a pipeline or pipelines as discussed earlier.
With respect to documentation, why has APA not behaved in a transparent, open manner and had examples of these documents available for people to review prior? And you made a comment before that you would meet with people and then they could see their solicitors. Why don't you have these documents within a draft form so people can be reviewing them with their solicitors under no pressure? Naturally, once you have people visiting you, asking for your signature, you're feeling a degree of pressure. And as has been pointed out by another member of the community, there is a degree of splitting and pressure exerted within the community on those things, and also with relationship to the easement. There's a great disparity of the parties' negotiation ability, considering that you have formulated where the pipeline's going, and then you're saying we have a right to our solicitors to have an open and free negotiation. Well, you've got a government document, you've got under, I can't remember the act, you have said you will seek and have been granted the right to these easements. So what negotiation do we really have?
So there's a couple of points to the question. I'll try and answer the first part, which is around the easement deed and copies of that easement deed. Look, one of the reasons why that has not been made available to anyone is that we're only in the final stages of drafting those documents. We now have those available to us, and we will be starting presenting those to landowners in the very near term. And that'll be through a formal process of presenting those documents to landowners. We would not be seeking a landowner to sign any of those documents on the day they're presented, not by any stretch. The letter that I have seen that my team has drafted for the commencement of those negotiations says very clearly on the front of that letter that you are recommended to obtain independent legal advice in relation to this matter and the documents that are attached. So simple answer is that in the very near future we will be commencing putting those documents in front of people.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, Simon Fagan. Why are you actually talking easement negotiation at this point in time when clearly the room is totally against the pipeline and you're just steamrolling this out without negotiating or considering what the communities are wanting? The fact that we don't want a coal seam gas wells on our doorstep, we don't want the Sandos project, and that's been established many years ago. This is not a new fight. You guys have just stumbled into this, but the fact that you think now that you can move this into a negotiation on easement when you haven't even got any member or very few members of the community are actually in support of your project. So why would you be taking it to a level that you know you're going to get rejected? We're not going to sign it. We will not sign it.
So I think it is very normal for proponents of linear infrastructure of all sorts to seek security regarding the route that they're proposing and to progress the development of that route through obtaining agreement from the landowners that it's impacting on. It's the same for pipelines, it's the same for power lines and all forms of linear infrastructure. As a business that's investing significant money in developing a project, it's normal course of action for us to obtain that, I guess, increased route confidence as we go through the development of a project. Look, I've got very strong confidence about large sections of the pipeline, Simon, I do.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So do you want to go on, Paul, with that?
I was just going to say, a lot of people have been prepared to talk about where a pipeline might be best suited. And some of those people may hold views around coal seam gas, but they've been prepared to engage and at least try and understand what a pipeline might look on their property. As Jim said, we've had, I guess, both ends of the spectrum responses. We do have a number of people who have engaged quite well with us. Yeah, we understand the pipeline needs to be continuous. That's certainly understood. That's our core business. And I guess we'll probably get to some of these questions later on. Obviously, with any linear infrastructure, if one piece is missing, it's a problem. So it's certainly not our base case, but there is the capacity for the minister and the department to fill in those gaps, if you will.
Thank you, Paul. I'll just hand it
and can I just stress, that's not something we have the power to do. It's something that, if we're unsuccessful making all of our negotiations of the easement, that it's a recourse that we can apply for, but it's certainly not our decision.
Thanks, Paul.
That was my question. Joe Holmes, out near the Five Ways. The discussion has been about how the outcome is to be implemented, and it's like you got a free pass. My initial contact was greeted with no, I'm not interested. The next contact was I need an education. I'm wondering if this is enough education for me, and if it is, I think it's more than enough, double done. No is still there on my agenda. Will you respect that decision? And as far as you talk about legal implications and all the rest, it's just no. It doesn't require interviews and mediation and all that crap. So I'll just leave it at that with you. But will you respect that decision for this? Well, for me, for this community to say no, and you, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks for the question. I appreciate it. I think probably the key point there is that if every linear infrastructure project, no matter what it was, a pipeline, a power line, a road or a railway line in this country, did not have a statutory mechanism which allowed a company to still pursue a route despite a landowner's preference that it didn't occur, no linear infrastructure in this country would get built. And that's why the legislation exists. That's why we have the ability to apply to the Minister for that assistance. But history shows that it is a very high bar to cross, and that APA as an organisation will need to demonstrate that we have done everything reasonable to negotiate an outcome before anything like that would be granted.
Right, thanks, Jim. Gentleman down the front.
Philip Mills. I've got probably out 5 ways. In 2015, Santos and AGL signed an agreed principles of land access to say that landholders were at liberty to say no to gas companies coming through the land. And the gas companies wouldn't go where they were unwelcome, and they wouldn't bully, intimidate or harass landholders. Will APA sign such an agreement with our community?
So the Santos agreement that was signed by Santos and AGL and various other parties at the time is very clear in what it relates to. And Santos have reiterated this a number of times in public forums and at their own CCC. That agreement relates to drilling activities and any proposal to drill wells on land. It doesn't relate to linear infrastructure for the very reasons that I just said, in terms of the fact that at the end of the day, linear infrastructure needs to go from point A to point B, and if one landowner in the middle says no, then you know, the pipeline can't be achieved.
So is that a yes or a no?
The simple answer is no.
Right, thank you. Might continue on the next slide too. I think, Paul, that was your part of the slide. Done? You reckon you've answered most of the next few slides?
I'm happy to roll with questions, Matt, if there's more.
Yeah, well, look, I just think...
On the pipeline, the balance of the slides talk about some of the frequently asked questions, a lot of which have been touched on now.
Yep. And it might generate some more questions, I thought, Paul.
Sure.
So if you want to, Jim, we can go through. But again, feel free to stick your hand up and ask a question as relevant. So, Jim, if you want to take over from that one.
Is there anyone in the room that wants me to talk about the route of the pipeline? Or do people know enough about it? So, to talk about... Sorry?
Just hold on a sec, Dave. I'll just make sure everyone can hear.
David Russ from over at Warren. Have you got any intention, yes or no, of going down the rail corridor, inland rail, if you get a knockback here?
So no, I can't foresee, I guess, what might play out if this project doesn't proceed in its current form. You know, I don't have a crystal ball. I guess I'm confident in the route that we've got and that we continue to work on. What I can say is that when we were working on the route for this project, the inland rail route was not yet finalised and not known. It was a consideration in terms of route options, but it was ruled out due to some of the conflicts that would exist between route planning for a pipeline and for a railway line in terms of the technical considerations and the like.
Can I follow up on that, Jim? Just because that's an interesting question. And I know a little bit about the inland rail. I was involved in that a little bit when I was Mayor of Dubbo. Obviously, an inland rail needs to go through various towns along the way. I would imagine, and again, I'm not an expert on this pipeline, I'd imagine that you'd want to keep pipelines away from town so that the inland rail might be okay when you get out of town, but once you get close to town, then it would have to deviate anyway. Is that a basic level of understanding?
There is a range of considerations. Probably the key one, though, is that where inland rail leads, and it's a simplistic view to think that following inland rail would provide a be-all and end-all solution for the pipeline. For those that know the route, the inland rail comes down to Narromine and then continues south from there. We have a pipeline called the Central West Pipeline that runs up through Parkes and up to Narromine and then on to Dubbo. If you've driven between Dubbo and Narromine along the highway there, you would have seen the pipeline markers in the road verge. We also, I guess, a related question to the Inland Rail one, we get asked a lot, why aren't you connecting down to here and then following that pipeline, which is, if we were to follow Inland Rail, what we would need to do. This pipeline, Central West Pipeline, is a highly constrained easement. It was a much smaller pipeline and was able to be built within a more limited easement, including in instances within operating road reserves and the like. It's also constrained from a terrain perspective. It's a far windier route, and overall length, if we were to come down here and follow through to the MSP, becomes significantly longer for the pipeline we're looking at, which is why we've ended up with the western option that we're considering now. And significantly more costly. There's no hiding that fact. This pipeline will run to something like $1 million a kilometre, and the feasibility of the pipeline is somewhat linked to an efficient length being achieved.
Thanks, Jim. So I'm happy for you to keep going.
So, I think most people know the broad route, but generally speaking, we head across the top of the Pilliga before heading southwest from the northwest corner of the Pilliga, and then heading down northwest of Coonamble, northwest of Warren. We cross the Mitchell Highway about 12 k's west of Nevertire, come down across the Bogan River, pass down near the Five Ways, as people have referenced, and then head down to the Moomba Sydney pipeline. Nearest locality is Mount Hope, which is about 35 kilometres away. In coming up with this route, APA did consider a wide range of options, including options much further to the east, down through the Liverpool Plains region, central options which came down through that sort of Narromine stretch that I mentioned before, and this was actually the most western of options that we considered. There will be discussion about those options and the consideration that was given to those in our EIS, which is due to be lodged in around Q2 of this year. Any questions on route before I move on to environmental assessment?
Yeah, Kate?
Yeah, thanks. The SEARS and EIS requirements clearly state the need to identify areas of high biodiversity value and apply the principles of an ecologically sustainable project. So why then did APA choose a route that clearly goes through such a high diverse area in the region of the river, the Macquarie River, which could clearly have been avoided? You've chosen the most heavily flooded part of the river that there is, and the one with an ephemeral wetland of high value, and the one with the biggest area of remnant veg. Now that clearly does not abide by the normal requirements. You've avoided disturbed agricultural land.
So there are a range of broad considerations that come into route selection. Ecological sensitivity of the sites is one of those. Land use is another key one, and in that particular part of the alignment, it is a highly constrained section of the alignment west of Warren there, in terms of a combination of intensively farmed agriculture, environmentally sensitive areas and other factors. I remain confident, and the work that my team's done from an environmental assessment perspective, we remain confident at this stage that there are solutions available in that area. As I've said to Tom before, we'd be very keen to talk to you more about what can be done on those properties.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Jim. One more question on the route.
With respect to the route, you appear to have made substantial deviations. If you examine the route very closely on 6 maps, you've made substantial deviations around major irrigation properties and gone down TSRs. And then you state that the conservation value of remnant vegetation within road reserves and stock routes is also an important consideration. Have you given consideration that we as individual landholders may have the same conservation value of remnant vegetation on our land? It means that where it's economically not viable to take on the irrigation industry, you have avoided their land, but you are prepared to sacrifice broadacre farming and grazing.
My answer to the question is going to be similar to the last one, in that route selection is a matter of trade-offs. There are considerations that need to be made in terms of whether it be land use, environmental factors, or other environmental constraints. A lot of the changes that have been made since the original alignment was announced have been in response to landowner feedback regarding preferences, if the pipeline is to be located on their property, where they would prefer to see it. One of those changes was some of our early engagement with people down here, and a number of people said we would prefer it up on that northern boundary along Plumbers Road. and we made that change. I will admit that there was limited feedback from landowners after we made that change. I'm guessing for other reasons, such as what Brian shared earlier. In terms of, I guess, micro changes within properties, one of the other things that we're doing at the moment through the EIS process is that our ecologists are doing a lot of work on mapping individual sections of vegetation, and that reporting will recommend further minor changes to the alignment to avoid certain areas of vegetation. So consultation with landowners to, I guess, address land use constraints and minimise impacts on their operations, as well as feedback from our technical people on the conservation status of different areas of vegetation.
So does this mean then?
Just 1 second, I'll just get the microphone up to you.
Does this mean then that APA's decided that you've finished all your surveying and you've moved on to EIS and you're about to lodge that, and that's it, you've done everything now and you're up to that next step?
That's correct. We are not undertaking additional surveys in the foreseeable future. We feel that we have enough information to prepare an EIS for submission. I would make it clear to people that we don't need to go on every property to be able to fulfil the requirements of the SEARS. It is a sampling approach. That's what's allowed under the SEARS and the Framework for Biodiversity Assessment in New South Wales. I guess the proof will be through the assessment process. If the state requires to go back and do additional work, that is a normal, I guess, process for projects of this nature, is that there are submissions received from the various agencies as well as from members of the public, and we will be required to do additional work to address those, and that may include additional survey activity.
So Jim, I'm sorry to keep asking questions here, but sometimes some questions pop to mind. So let's say the state government approves the EIS with the route that's there, and then you talk to a landholder and they say, well, okay, it's been approved there, but I really would like it moved just over here because it would be less valuable land or whatever it might be.
Yep.
Even though the EIS might be approved, are you still open to changing it? And I'm not talking about going an extra 50 kilometres because that's an extra $50 million, but if someone wants to change it within reason, you're still open to that even after an EIS might be approved?
Absolutely. I guess the process that would occur is that the EIS will outline a framework for changes to the alignment post-approval should one be granted. And the nature of that would be APA having to demonstrate that it's in agreement with the landowner and that it results in a no net worsening of impacts to the environment. So it's being done to address a landowner concern from a land use perspective or an operations perspective, and by doing that we're not all of a sudden clearing additional hectares of a certain vegetation community that may be protected, for example.
Thanks, Jim. Sorry, Brian?
Yeah, Brian Plummer. I was going to leave it till a bit later, but we're still talking about this route. I think most of us are feeling fairly rooted, unfortunately. But the early in our consultation phase, personally, it was all done by emails. I raised with APA the situation, and unfortunately our local mayor's not here to address this issue, which I'm sure he'd love to. We had local farmers had an accident with a contractor on their private property. The tractor was written off. Their son was put through the windscreen of the tractor. The outcome's over $250,000 worth of damage to those landholders that the Shire has walked away from with no coverage of them. They've had to buy another tractor. And it's looking like going down to court, say 3 years' time or whatever. They've got to wear the expenses of that. I raised that circumstance with APA as a concern of mine because at this stage you've got the same answer as I gave Lachlan Shire. They no longer have access to our property. Our business plan as an operating partnership does not allow us, the OH&S, risk for that to occur on any of our properties. You guys deemed that an irrelevant concern. Unfortunately, I deem it a very relevant concern. I went to the same school as Holmesy for a while and I've been educated. The word is still no. Paul said you need to fill the gaps in, but you're going to have a 9.5k gap out here where you guys will not be going through. That's my position. So where do I go from here? Because if you want a shit fight, I'll bring on a shit fight, but it's probably going to be at my own expense, but it's not going to be real good for you blokes publicly either. So where do we go? Because no is no. There's no other way to go. It's a pretty simple word. Jim made the point about, okay, these infrastructure projects always have the backing of the legislation it's needed to get through for problem people like me. But they're usually different. People acknowledge they need freight. They acknowledge they need power. They don't acknowledge that they need coal seam gas on a broader community basis. So the answer is still no. So I don't know where you guys have put me. I'm educated, but I don't know where I'm going.
So I'll just narrow down. So the specific question, Brian, in relation to what you said.
Matt, I can answer the first part of the question, which is Brian's referring to an indemnity situation that occurred on his property, and made statements to us at the time in terms of I guess the potential that something like that could happen as a result of our activities. What I can say to that, and I don't know if this answer has been given to you before, Brian, and my apologies if it hasn't. Any agreement that we enter into with landowners will include an indemnification arrangement which makes APA liable for any loss or damages that result from the actions that we're undertaking on the property. I'm trying to put that in the simplest terms possible, because indemnity clauses are the type of things that lawyers go backwards and forwards on for days. But our intent as APA is to provide a broad indemnification that takes responsibility for our actions on the property.
Thanks, Jim. Oops, sorry, Brian.
Clarification. Yeah, I was hopefully, you probably misunderstood where I come from earlier in the piece, so I'll try and be a little bit clearer. I was trying to open into negotiations initially with you guys before I come to a no position. And the opportunity was on the table for you guys to work with the Lachlan Shire. You have to go through them to produce this gas pipeline with no gaps. And that was an opportunity for you to work with the Lachlan Shire to give us a community resolution to the problem that occurred with this farmer's tractor.
Yeah,
and you guys shut that door, so we're back to no. Thank you.
So, I'll reiterate it, Brian, because to be honest, it remains not a relevant consideration to APA that you have had an issue with council accessing your property. We're not in a position where we're going to start negotiating with Lachlan Shire Council to settle a claim that you have against them.
I don't have a personal claim. I have a major concern personally.
You mentioned court action before. That's the only reason I referenced it.
With the landowner involved. I'm not the landowner involved.
Sure.
So anyway, that issue there, Brian, I assume was with Lachlan Shire, not with APA, wasn't it? Yeah. Right, thank you. Okay. Right, I'll just go. Sorry, just gentleman here. I'll just go down the gentleman behind you first, sir, and then I'll come back to you.
Doug Storer from Warren. The indemnity thing has been brought up. Are you aware of landholders' concerns regarding insurance? And can you guarantee that you will work with landholders to completely allay those concerns? Will landholders have to take on insurance companies and APA if something goes wrong?
Maybe I can answer that. And again, part of this answer comes back to getting the independent advice. APA will offer very strong and broad indemnities, and your lawyers may seek to make adjustments to that and clarification. APA carries very broad insurance. APA operates 15,000 kilometres of pipelines, which the indemnities sit with those easements for time, regardless of landowner changes. So I think the short answer is yes. We believe we will be able to satisfy you and your advisors that you will not be subject to loss, damage or expense associated with APA's activities or exercising its rights under the easement.
Thanks, Paul. I'll just jump to this one on.
Yep. Just on that indemnity policy, I thought the pipeline was coming through us, and I do have a copy of your indemnity policy. I'd love for us to be able to get that to the Lachlan Shire, but I've read your indemnity policy and I would have no trouble with that policy whatsoever. So I don't know how many other people have seen the policy. It is quite in depth.
Yeah, and look, can I just clarify, and thank you for your comment. The indemnity you're referring to there, and people would understand that both there's the authority to survey provided by government, but we've also had agreements we can enter into people with those early works. We've extended an indemnity in that early access. It will be very similar, perhaps actually slightly more broader and wordy in the easement documents that are presented for people to consider.
That voluntary agreement is available through our website. There is a copy of that voluntary agreement attached to the minutes of the first CCC meeting. I'm happy to provide it to anyone that hasn't seen it. In terms of the indemnity clause that sits in there. The indemnity clause in our easement deed will be very similar to the one that's in that agreement.
Thanks, Paul.
One other minor comment I might say, and this is just a bit of context. In APA's world, talking about pipelines to landowners, the two biggest things that are talked about are location on the property and depth relative to use, and the indemnity. They take up a huge amount of people's focus, and that's really just being reflected here today again. So it's something we're fully aware of. We wouldn't expect anyone to enter into an agreement with us if they weren't appropriately indemnified.
Thanks, Paul. I've just got Kate here, and then a gentleman, and then a couple more before I go back up front. So I've got a few lined up there.
Okay, we're still on this indemnity question. I have been through a problem such as this before, and I know that what happens is it's all about whose proof, was it my act or an act of God? And it gets back to the landholder has to be the person to actually prove that. And that's where our cost comes down to. Insurance companies are extremely good at turning around and saying, well, that was an act of God, that was a flood, bad luck, or that was your machine that happened to go across that particular pipe, and we're the ones that have to pursue that. It's not going to be APA pursuing it, we are going to have to pursue it, and we're the ones that end up in court having to do it. It's all about those fuzzy questions. Whose responsibility is it?
Look, I can understand people may have had experience with various insurance companies around various events. What I'm saying is people can check and satisfy themselves, hopefully, through legal advice. I guess putting my other part of my job hat on, we look after the landowner relationships with around 10,000 landowners across Australia. We do not have a suite of disputes around insurance and the like. Occasionally we do have disagreements with landowners about what they think is our cost and the like, but it is not part and parcel, and we don't have extensive litigation around those matters. You can always paint a particular scenario about a particular event and put it up there. What I'm saying is there will be an indemnity that can be scrutinised and adjusted by your lawyers and our lawyers negotiating those out. The insurance side of thing, APA has all manner of insurance. We're one of the top 50 companies in Australia where we can stand behind any indemnity that we put forward.
So you're going to guarantee that a landholder will not be responsible if there was damage to the hydrology of the river system due to your pipeline?
Again, it'll need to be read in the context of the indemnity. So if APA... this is the correct answer. If the outcome you speak of is attributed to an activity of APA or exercising its rights under the easement document and there is a loss associated with it to the landowner, that's what the indemnity is meant to cover.
And my point is that the answer will be, oh, this was a flood and we couldn't know what was going to happen. And we are saying you're going through a highly flooded, highly risky spot, and that is a high risk. And so we're stuck in the middle.
Again, let's see if our clever lawyers between us can't negotiate something. No, yours and ours.
And what happens when the pipeline's decommissioned? You don't own it. So then who's liable?
We will not be allowed to hand back our pipeline licence until we have satisfied the pipeline regulator in New South Wales as to an appropriate remediation plan. And what's required for that could vary at different locations on the pipeline route. I think probably worth also, and there's a slide on this later, you've spoken about sensitive riverine environments. We're certainly well aware of the issues Tom's raised with us at the CCC. We have construction technique of horizontal directional drilling, and as we've said to Tom, this could well be one of those situations where the pipeline ends up being 20 metres or so beneath the ground, ameliorating a whole range of concerns you have by not actually having to disturb some of those sensitive areas. Now, we're not committing to that now. This is about providing information about our project and what we can do. Again, we've said it to Tom and other landowners who've got these very site-specific issues. Engage with us, listen to our experts. You may come to a conclusion of no at the end of it. That's fine. We just want to be heard and make sure that we combine science, engineering and indemnities to see whether we can't get something people can feel comfortable with.
Thank you, Paul. Just jump over here, and I've got a lady at the front again after this.
This is a question in regards to the route again, just jumping back to that very, very quickly. A couple of meetings ago, the CCC committee asked the question about whether the valves, scraper stations and staff camps would be identified on the map. Something that early in the piece you said has to be so many metres apart. So to me it seems a clear thing that you can place on the map. Your answer to a question at the last CCC meeting was, once again, this will happen and will show up on the public map once landholders have discussed it with APA. So again, we're back to the situation where each individual landholder will have the option or not the option to have either a valve, a scraper station or a staff camp on their farm. Should they choose not to, does that then get moved on to the next farmer down the pipeline if they don't want it on their farm?
Thanks, Lois. I'll talk a little bit broadly, first and foremost, about what's required. This is mentioned in some of the documentation that's available at the front of the room as well. Generally speaking, we'll be looking for a total of 5 what we refer to as surface facilities along the length of the pipeline. They are typically referred to as either mainline valves or scraper stations. And what they are is infrastructure that allows us to isolate individual sections of the pipeline. Relatively small enclosures. A mainline valve would be somewhere near a quarter of the size of this room, and a scraper station would be just under the full size of this room. The scraper stations are a little bit different from a valve. Scraper stations allow us to insert cleaning units called PIGs, or pipeline inspection gauges, into the pipeline for its maintenance over time. Now, I think it's reasonable that before we confirm locations for that we consult with landowners where we might be proposing them. We are doing that at the moment in relation to mainline valves, scraper stations, and then finally, temporary construction camps.
So you're doing that now, so if I'm a landholder and you haven't contacted us, then it's not on our part. Is that what you're saying?
At this point in time, we're not pursuing one in that location. That's correct. Yeah.
Thanks, Jim.
This is back to your wonderful insurance that covers everything. Can APA guarantee that farmers who are going to have the pipeline going through their land are going to be able to carry on their operations as they do today into the future with no introduction of weeds, no restriction on weight limits, topsoil rehabilitated, NVD issues, your insurance is covering everything, biosecurity, anthrax and the rest?
So in terms of, I guess there's a number of points in there. In relation to things like biosecurity, there will be very strict conditions placed on any approval granted by government in relation to how biosecurity is managed. I would expect that one of those requirements would be adoption of any property-specific biosecurity plans in relation to the construction on that particular property. That is normal practice for pipeline construction. In relation to indemnification, I think Paul's provided an answer there in relation to how that works. And was there a third point? So, yep. So in relation to ongoing farming operations, the normal operations of things like cultivation can continue across this pipeline easement once it is constructed. The indemnification that we provide covers loss, and if something occurs in that pipeline, such as some settlement, we are responsible to come back and address that, and in addition, we would be responsible for compensating you for any additional loss that was incurred as a result of that particular area being out of action for an additional time.
I'll come back to that question, Jim. I'll just try and keep people in order and keep going through. I just had the gentleman around the back, then I'll jump up to the front there.
Yeah, Tony Van Leeuwenhoek again. I've got a question. The easement is 30 metres. What will the actual disturbed land look like? A couple of metres?
30 metres, yeah. So that full 30 metre width will be cleared and graded for its full width. I do have some photos which I'll get to in the presentation.
So that'll 30 metres wide will be disturbed.
That's correct.
That could possibly, in the worst case scenario, be across your entire property, could it?
Possibly.
Okay.
Yep.
So you guys might not know this. You probably don't get much problems except for birds. I'm probably being presumptuous, but if you live in town, this is probably not an issue. But you can have, and anyone in this room who has land will verify this. You can have a paddock. I'm a grazier at heart. I'm a farmer too. So you can have a paddock that is just good grazing country, right? And no burrs. And the one that I have, and I think pretty much through the west, everyone will verify. I have just done it. I put a fence line down. You had to disturb it. I couldn't help that. As soon as it rains, pretty well any time of year, where you've got your easement, you will have 30 metres wide, a ribbon going across your property of wall-to-wall Bathurst burrs. Now, I know that doesn't seem important to you, but it is to me. I want to know, A, who's going to control them, and you will never get rid of them. You might control them. Don't use the word that you eradicate them. You will not, okay? You won't. I can tell you that from 40-odd years of experience. Okay, so who's going to control them? And when you guys are long gone, retired to your homes on the coast, and probably everyone's forgotten us, we're still going to be controlling them because you guys will give it up. I can tell you now.
Look, I think you've spoken of absolute reality. You're dead right. Soil disturbance can lead to the germination of seed that can sit in the soil for 30, 40 years. We understand that. We know that. We build a lot of pipelines. We're not farmers ourselves, but we come across these issues all the time. The the important thing is having the best possible follow-up spraying regimes in place. And so I'm not talking about eradication, but what I'm saying is where there's predictable and foreseeable events, we would, in an example of what you've just spoken there, get to understand the time of year, the circumstance when that would occur, and put in a preemptive spraying regime or control mechanism. I'd love to hear a follow-up, but I think the other thing is, we also see things happen at particular weather events many years after construction on some of our pipelines. So we get a super wet winter, or there's a paddock gets perhaps stocked slightly heavier than the landowner has before, and it breaks out not just on our old easement but also on adjoining areas. So these things do happen. We're not going to say they don't, but the important thing is we're alert to them. We would love to be able to negotiate and agree what is likely to be the focus period immediately after construction, how to manage them, and again the indemnity would stand there for the inevitables. And I'd put the question back to you. You put the fence in, you got the burrs, we'd like to know what you did to get back on top of those, and we'd like to replicate it.
Well, that's my problem, not yours. I decided I was going to put a fence down. I didn't decide you guys were going to come and invade my property.
I respect that.
Now, second point, I do appreciate your honesty, okay? You were reasonably forthright. But I don't care what you say about... You will not, as I said before, you will never eradicate them. And they will come in numbers, and next year they'll be worse. You can spray them, you will minimise them, and in a good season they probably won't even be there, or a very bad season, okay? But you will not get rid of them. So I think what we're getting back to is what these fellas down the front said, Joe and Brian. We don't want the pipeline, so work it out. Now, just look around this room. Most people in this room have probably been farming for, looking at the average, 20 or 30 years. Most of us come from, in my own case, I come from 130 years that we've owned that block of land, one way or another. In that time, it might come as a shock to you, but we've lived through drought, floods, bloody pests, we've had storms, and all this stuff is increasing. They're getting longer and harder, and the storms are getting more violent. And guess what? We're still here, and we'll be still here when you leave. Please go.
There's a question down the front here. I'll just let the lady ask in terms of weight limits on the pipeline.
Yeah, we can't seem to get an answer on... My name's Joe Eldridge, a landowner, Five Ways. None of us seem to be clear on what the weight limit is on these easements where our heavy machinery crosses. So can someone verify that, please, the weight limit?
So the clearest answer I can give to that, and it's in our documentation that we've handed out at the front here, it's in black and white exactly our position in relation to weight limits. There is not a standard weight limit that applies universally across the pipeline alignment. It will depend on the depth of burial and the soil conditions that exist on that particular property. What we've committed to is that if a landowner sits with us and tells us exactly what their machinery requirements are, we will ensure that the pipeline is designed to accommodate them. If that means we have to go to an additional depth of cover or thicker wall pipe, or whatever it may be, we will make that commitment in the easement documents, and it will be clearly agreed.
You still never said any mention of the word tonnage to any heavy...
What I said is that there is no specific tonnage that applies universally around the pipeline. I will address an issue right now that I know might come up. There is a photograph that's been shared regarding a pipeline easement in Queensland, which has there's a sign on a gate that has a reference to a 4-tonne weight limit on that easement. The document that I've handed out today has our response to that issue. It's a section of the Roma-Brisbane pipeline on the Darling Downs, and in that particular area there is a lot of construction activity with drill rigs and all sorts of things like that that are what we would consider third-party encroachments to that easement. As a result, an incredibly conservative limit has been applied to access by third parties to that easement to prevent potential for overweight limits to get onto that easement. It does not apply to the landowner that owns that property.
Thanks, Jim. I've just got a question down the back here.
With respect to fencing and fence repairs or constructing new fencing, as far as my reading of the literature that's available is that you have to seek APA's permission in writing, you have to have APA staff there under an APA work permit system, and you may need to do a risk analysis report even to replace existing fencing. Could you provide us with information on that aspect?
I'll ask Paul to do it because he's responsible for that part of our business. So probably best place to answer.
Look, all we're trying to do is protect the pipeline in any of those. The scenario you talk of replacing a fence, possibly, like for like, even sometimes using the new holes. Of course, we want to understand when people are going to be penetrating, for example, below 400 millimetres, unless it's been pre-approved in an easement document. So in some circumstance, when someone wants to put a big new strainer post, within 5 metres of the pipeline, yeah, we probably would want to come out there at our cost, certainly on a landowner cost, to verify the location of the pipeline and make sure that the strainer post or the auger going in doesn't strike that pipeline. The easement document will talk about certain restrictions on the landowner, which are all around pipeline safety, but there's also a clause in there saying that the agreement of APA shall not be unreasonably withheld. Fencing happens week in, week out across our easements. It's a very straightforward process. For example, if someone said it was a suspension fence just using steel droppers and there were only going to be steel droppers, probably almost no one would be interested. But when you are talking about large strainer posts using bigger equipment to auger down near the pipeline, we would be interested. But I can't recall one situation where we haven't been able to easily accommodate the landowner's property planning.
Thanks, Paul. Just back to the front again.
I'm not buying this 4-tonne limit rubbish that it's only on that one thing. 4 states have said that if you have a high pressure pipeline, 4 tonne is the limit. So you want to say heavy machinery and they're a third party. What's heavy machinery? Everybody cropping down here runs multiple road trains, multiple headers, multiple mother bins, multiple whatever. If you're a grazier and you've got 10 by 400 kilo steers, that's heavy. So, I'm not buying this rubbish.
I'll only reiterate my answer. There's not a 4-tonne weight limit proposed, and there will not be. We are fully confident that we'll be able to accommodate a full range of machinery, and that includes things like your 100 and 150 tonne mother bins, your fully loaded grain trucks, and the like. And they are considerations that our engineering team have taken on board during the preliminary work that they've done to date. I would love to be able to sit here and say that it's X tonnes and that's the limit across the pipeline. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Because there are different conditions, different burial depths across the pipeline which will dictate what the actual limit is.
Thanks. I didn't mention him earlier because he is out of territory, but we've got the Warren Mayor here, Rex Wilson.
Thanks, Matthew. Yes, I am out of my patch, a long way from home. But my question concerns the state election in 13 months' time from now. Should there be a change of government and a change of attitude towards coal seam gas in general, what progress do you anticipate making in your pipeline route, and will it be irrevocable what you undertake?
Look, I think the simple answer for that is that we're planning a piece of infrastructure. We don't sit there thinking about elections. If projects aren't approved, Narrabri gas isn't approved, there'll be no gas to put in a pipeline. So I don't think we'll get into the political realm. APA is a company. It just works with whatever the government of the day is and lives by its rules.
Yeah, I was about to say that's a point that I thought of then.
Okay.
Do you have some idea, because obviously Rex has made the point, 13 months, and as much as this is all about the pipeline, Paul, obviously, as you said, if Narrabri doesn't go ahead, well, you don't need a pipeline. Do you have any idea, and I know predicting when a government might approve something is difficult, but do you have any idea of when there might be approvals for this, and I know it's pretty hard, but the CSG as well?
Yeah, look, and Jim might answer some of the back end of this question better. Put it in context, I think it's coming up to around 12 months since Santos lodged their EIS. Jim's indicated sometime in the second quarter of this year we'll lodge our EIS. Timeframes for all assessments and all government processes are getting longer. I might leave it to Jim to maybe estimate a range of when our EIS might be addressed.
So the slide I've put on the screen, and apologies if the text size is too small, it wasn't my intent, but as Paul mentioned there, EIS lodgement, our target for that at the moment is Q2 2018. I've previously said in a public forum that our target for that was Q1 2018, and that's due to slippages in our program that have occurred over that period of time. We continue to work on that document at the moment. It is nearing completion. There's a range of internal reviews that need to occur before it's ready to submit. When it does, it'll go to the department for what's called an adequacy check. It's not a formal process. It's a short check that they do to make sure that all of the key requirements for the SEARs are addressed. Not that it's adequate, not that the assessment should be approved or not, but just that the content is there. They provide any comments back to us, and then we'll get that submission out on public exhibition in a timely fashion. The minimum under the legislation is 30 days for public exhibition. It's not unusual, as we saw with the Santos project, for large or controversial projects to be extended so that people have a longer period of time to make submissions. And I would not be surprised if that was to occur on this project as well. But that's not our commitment to make. It's something for the department. In relation to the process from there, the assessment process then moves forward. If there are submissions received, which is likely obviously, we are required to address those, and that's the stage that Santos are at with their project at the moment. I don't have any clarity on where they are in terms of addressing those submissions and when they expect to lodge their response, but in terms of the work that we would do, I would expect that that would take the best part of the rest of 2018 in terms of responding to any submissions that are received, and a decision's not likely, I would think, until sometime in early 2019. There is another element that comes into it. There is a process in New South Wales called the Planning and Assessment Commission. With certain delegations, that commission takes responsibility for different types of approvals. It takes it out of the hands of the bureaucrats and the politicians. The expectation I have is that this project is likely to go down that path as well. That introduces a process of public hearings and other requirements at the back end of the process. So, simple answer is that it would be sometime in the first half of, no earlier than sometime in the first half of 2019.
Which is exactly as Rex was talking about with an election, which makes it more difficult, but nothing that you can really handle unless you can...
Out of my control.
That's right. Thanks.
Yes, Simon Cant from Warren. Look, the election was mentioned, and I'd be interested. Has APA ever made any political donations?
Absolutely. APA has made a number of political donations. Our political donations of relevance to this project are declared on the major projects website as part of our preliminary environmental assessment submission. It's open for everyone to view. It has been since February of last year. I think you'll find that there's donations there to parties of all political persuasion.
So are you able to list them, Jim?
Not off the top of my head. It runs to a number of pages.
But probably the major political parties, would you think?
That would be correct.
And the minor ones too?
I couldn't answer that. I'm not sure. I know it definitely includes the major ones. I don't know if it includes any independents or minors.
Sure. So further on from that, has APA offered any career opportunities for current New South Wales parliamentarians?
Not that I'm aware of, Kevin. Is this a gotcha moment? Is there one I don't know about? I don't know. Good.
Thanks. Just down the front there again. That was your next slide after the route map, wasn't it, Jim? That was the next slide. Thank you.
I'm still confused, I'm sorry. How have you moved on into your EIS if you haven't finished your survey? It's been fairly obvious, maybe it hasn't been to you guys, but to pretty much all the landholders, that we've all said no access to survey. So how have you finished doing all that surveying to say that yes, you can lodge an EIS?
So the methodology that's required for field surveys for things like ecology doesn't require you to go to every patch of every vegetation along an alignment. It's a sampling-based strategy. This is what's set out under the legislation. And where you can't access a certain section of property, you can make conservative assumptions. So if you're looking for particular threatened ecological communities, for example, rather than going there and confirming that they exist, you can assume that they do. And make those sort of conservative assumptions in the assessment. That will all be publicly available. You'll be able to see exactly where we surveyed and where we haven't. And it'll be in the EIS, which, like I mentioned, will be submitted in Q2 of this year.
Thanks, Jim.
Tony Kelly, a landowner out at the Five Ways, and just on your point there, I can't see how you've got any information within that area, because anybody in this room that's from that area hasn't allowed you on. And what are the gaps that you haven't surveyed or got your information from? And if you have, you must have jumped the fence and trespassed. And is that something you do?
So the simple answer to that is I'm not going to be giving anyone a surprise here to say that there's a section here through Tottenham where there is a group of landowners who are vehemently against the project, and the same thing exists in the Canamble region. As a result, the amount of access that's occurred in those regions is lower than in other areas, there's no doubt about that. My comments though in relation to sampling methodologies, work that can be done from public road reserves and stock routes, there's a range of work that can be achieved without having to access private property. The assessment of the adequacy of the information that we present will be a matter for the department when the EIS is submitted, and I guess it's a robust process. It's one that we have confidence in.
You're willing to say there's 25 kilometres there we haven't even been on?
It will be absolutely clear in the document that where we have surveyed and where we haven't completed survey.
And so you didn't answer my last question. So if you have that information and you haven't been given approval to get there, how did you get it?
So any property...
Did you trespass?
Any property access that's been undertaken for this project has been undertaken either under a voluntary landowner agreement or in accordance with an authority to survey that's been issued. Our position on that is in the leaflet that's available today, and we've provided that response to a number of other outlets as well. But on the inside cover of the 4-page handout is our position exactly on any of the accusations of trespass that have occurred in late November and December of last year. And in particular, I would say that the Department of Planning has made it absolutely clear in relation to some of the legal advice that's occurred in the past in relation to the nature of activities that are allowed under the ATS through clarifications on their website.
Jim, can I ask a question there? So, and trespassing is a strong accusation, and you made mention there of... No, sorry, but if someone said that they trespassed onto my property, I would think that was obviously something where it was really, coming into my private space. But you said something there, authority to survey. So, as part of the process, does the government give you permission to go onto properties with that ability to survey, after trying to contact the landholder, obviously, without actually requiring the landholder's permission?
In general terms, that's correct. There are conditions attached to that. Fergus is here. We entered his property late part of last year under the terms of that authority to survey. I'm entirely confident that we're acting legally. And there's been no, enforcement action taken by the department or the police in relation to any of the activity that occurred on that day. And I remain confident that we fulfilled the conditions under the authority to survey.
And do you also, obviously you want to get on the ground to survey things there, but do you also do things like use helicopters to go over a route so that you can actually see the topographical survey of a route that you might be looking at?
We undertook 2 aerial surveys for this project, Matthew, early on in particular, doing predominantly rapid vegetation assessment, which is looking at existing mapping and confirming whether or not it generally correlates with what's on the ground, as well as looking at some of the major waterway crossings.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, Fergus Lefebvre, Canamble. As Jim just said, you've sort of as far as I'm concerned, trespassed on my place at the end of last year, acting outside your guidelines of your authority. Our advice is you're not allowed to do ecological and, your and EIS sort of work. It's just purely surveying work you're allowed to do. You've sort of, the situation was the gates were locked, had signs, biosecurity, trespass signs with direct instructions to call me, which they didn't. They've just climbed the fence and gone in. What was it? 10 people went in.
It was less than that, but I think it was 7 or so.
7, and sort of out of that 7, sort of outside the sort of the guides of the authority, sort of 5 didn't have any identification. I was sort of shown no paperwork whatsoever. We sort of asked, there's a lot of chat about a court order, which APA didn't dismiss, and sort of this put the police in a really difficult position that sort of they lied to landholders saying there was a court order, but there wasn't. These guys sort of probably there for an hour and didn't dismiss that. These guys had backpacks and nets and all sorts of sort of prohibitive as far as I'm concerned, and my biosecurity. They've sort of marched in over that lock gate. Because of sort of our neighbourhood watch sort of set up, they're only in there for 30 minutes, so it couldn't have really done a great deal, even if they're allowed. And that's sort of through the Mulma Creek, which is sort of a creek, fast-running creek, which floods sort of quite a lot. And within a week, The other point I'd like to raise, it's 3:30 in the middle of summer, and not much happens as far as sort of bird life and insects and anything. It was a very dry sort of period, and within a week we had a rain event, and where those people were actually sort of filled with water. So to do, even if you were allowed, which we don't believe you are, to do an effective EIS, you definitely need several sort of come back repeatedly over sort of different periods on several occasions to get a fair indication. And yeah, you haven't touched the Castlereagh River, which is obviously a major, or the Macquarie. So it's looking like a pretty flimsy EIS, and from our advice, an illegal one.
So Jim, so I'll just let Jim just address those points first. Do you want to address any of those points?
I would absolutely reiterate my previously stated position that APA did not trespass. We acted within the terms of an authority which is granted by the state. The adequacy of that authority to grant authority for things like ecological surveys has since been clarified for landowners by the Department of Planning. And in relation to biosecurity matters, in all instances, we have written and provided written notice to landowners regarding our access and have provided them opportunity to present us with any property-specific biosecurity matters. In any instance where we've received those, we have fully complied with them.
Thanks, Jim. And that's probably a very specific issue that I assume that you know about that issue with Fergus and going with those ongoing conversations there. Fergus?
Yeah, my instruction was on the gate. That sign, call the owner before you go in.
No, and look, Fergus, I'll say that, there was a discussion around this at the last CCC meeting about where our action's adequate in terms of relying on the notices that we'd sent rather than that gate. There was quite a bit of discussion around that. Look, I'll take that we should have called that number. There's no doubt about that. Did we breach biosecurity though? I don't believe we do. We have a proper. We have a.
Well, let Jim go through and answer the question rather than just yelling out things at him, so he's got the opportunity, please. So Jim?
We have a protocol in place for risk assessment of biosecurity matters in relation to this project. It's available on our website, which handles the typical risks involved with the activities that we're undertaking. In the absence of specific feedback from landowners, we have fully complied with that protocol.
And again, I think Fergus and Jim, that sounds like a specific issue that you guys are both aware of and working through that, but it's good to bring it up. I think this young lady just asked the question about what do you define trespassing, and
so what I would refer to is there's an authority in place which allows us to undertake certain activities. That includes entry to private land.
And so that authority to survey, Jim, if a locked gate is there, you're allowed to climb that gate and go into that under that
it's
authority
never our
to survey.
It's never our preference to do that, but in an extreme situation, we have the ability to do it.
Right. So, sorry, we've just got a few. I'd like to try and keep one question at a time there. This lady's asking a couple of questions. Again, talking about that trespass, why did you climb the gate? I assume that you turned up, the gate was locked, the authority to survey, but as you've admitted, Fergus had a sign there. It probably would have been better if APA had have actually followed that. Now, someone gets it wrong, they can't be perfect all the time. I think there's an admission there by APA that certainly you could have done that a bit better, Jim.
I make an admission that we could have done better in relation to that one item, but I do stand by the fact that we appropriately managed the biosecurity risk and that we did not trespass.
Thank you. So I'll just let this lady ask again.
So can you stand here in this room, here and now, and say in front of all of us that you broke that breach on that gentleman's property, that it's not going to happen again to any other landowners? Can you verify that here and now?
What I will say is that the obligations that we have under that authority are clear. If there are matters of compliance that people think that they need to raise, the Department of Planning has made resources available to respond to those. At this point in time, I'm not aware of any. There may be claims that have been made, but they haven't been forwarded to me.
I just have one more question on this access thing. As APA have come into by stealth to get on access to agreements inadvertently signed before landholders were aware of their repercussions, can the landowners now null and void those agreements with APA if they want to?
Any voluntary agreement entered into with APA can be withdrawn at a moment's notice, and there have been a number that have been withdrawn during the course of this project.
So with all this controversy in the room today, do you notify those landowners that signed these agreements early on that they have that choice now, where they, at the time they signed, they didn't know that they did?
No, is the simple answer. We do not nominate, we do not contact everyone to say that there was a meeting with controversial issues raised. Do you want to reconsider your agreement? Of course not. But if people raise concerns with us and no longer wish to provide access, as I said, it has been in a number of instances the case, then the agreement can be withdrawn.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just jump back to this gentleman here.
Adam McRae, Canamble. I'd like to just punch out here section B of the authority to survey, to carry out surveys to investigate possible routes for the proposed pipeline and determine the pipeline route, the situation of any associated apparatus works and any lands to be used to get access to the pipeline apparatus or works. Now, doesn't say too much to me about ecological surveys. It doesn't say anything about cultural heritage surveys. The fact that the Department of Planning have actually gone and clarified that on their website, the ATS itself has not been changed. The department actually don't have the authority to change it. They have clarified it, but we still dispute the actual ATS. And to add to that, I would suggest that this little election there in 13 months might have a little bit to do with the fact that you fellas are just glossing over some of those details, feeding us a load of codswallop, and jumping fences and trying to hurry the process up and getting your EIS in as quickly as you possibly can.
Thanks. So I'm not sure if there's a specific question in there or it was more a statement, but the authority to survey, Jim, do you want to address that part of it?
Look, what I'll say is that we have our own legal advice as well. We believe that the situation is clear. ATSs exist purely for the purpose for which we are using it. That has been made clear in this room to the CCC at the last meeting by the Department of Planning and Environment. And I think the reference that they made at the time was if you don't agree with it, that the legal avenue is there to challenge it.
So,
It was, Amanda said, Angela said something very similar to that, Tom.
So Tom,
the minutes are clearly they're now available on the APA website, and the minutes state. Okay.
So it's not going to achieve anything by everyone just yelling out things. I'll just come down to a question down the back here.
Yeah, I think what Tom's saying is that at the meeting, apparently the minutes don't really sort of resemble strongly what was actually said. I think that's what he's getting upset about. That wasn't what I got up for. I'd just like to explain to you guys, you know, it probably seems odd, but, you know, it isn't just a house on our property. Our properties are like our home. So how would you feel if one of us decided to come wherever you live and just decide to walk in the front gate and walk around your garden and maybe come in the back door? You know, it's just the same for us. And if that was to happen in reverse, you know, we'd probably be arrested. I don't know why it doesn't work both ways, okay? My question, second question, that was a statement, sorry, is I've still got problems with this EIS. Can we get it quantified? Can you tell us, Jeff, like, I don't know, how many 100 Ks is it that you're going from Pillica to Condobolin?
460.
460. Can you quantify how many properties along that? Is it 5, 10, 15? Or in kilometres, you've surveyed, you've actually entered 3 kilometres worth of property? Because I don't think anyone in this room can believe that you have qualified to say you've done your EIS. Sorry.
So in terms of broad statistics around survey activity, again, this will be fully documented in the EIS, so it'll be there for everyone to read. We've also provided in our latest newsletter some facts and figures around some of the, the broad statistics. In approximate terms, I'm not going to quote an exact number, but in approximate terms, we've accessed around half of the properties along the alignment. In terms of kilometres of survey, I couldn't give you an accurate figure of what that translates to. It would vary depending on the nature of whether it's ecology or cultural heritage or soils. I don't have a figure that I've got at hand that can answer what that totals up to. But if you were to approximate based on half of the alignment, then it'll be something of that order.
So I know, Jim, we talked about before that Kevin's sitting there ready to take any questions and put them up on the website within 2 weeks. Is that information, and I know it's hard for you to have that information off the top of your head, is that something that Kevin could find out from the information you've got available and get up on the website? Is that information available?
There's a statement regarding the, I think it even says that we've undertaken, has anyone got the newsletter just there? There's a facts and figure box. I think it says a number of kilometres of survey. If not, let me review that information, Matt. I don't think we've got it easily at hand, but I'll get back to the...
we'll come back to that if you get a chance to look at the newsletter. I've got a couple other questions here. This gentleman here.
David Chadwick from Coonamble. I met with Les Devlin, the Deputy Director of the DPE, with our solicitor, Mary Lou Potts, and the Pipelines Act is extremely clear about what you guys are allowed and not allowed to do. Yep. We have not seen the advice from the DPE, they won't produce it, but Mary Lou Potts is very firm on the fact that if we say no, you're not coming on, that's where we stand and that's the end of it, and that dates back to the Magna Carta. So that's just to clear any misconception within the room. So the no case, if you did go down the path of compulsory acquisition, have you considered how long it's going to take you to run each landholder through the courts if that was your point of call, and if it was to go that way and you were defeated, what your compensation position would be? But most importantly, I know you guys have been given the notice of our meeting on Saturday, which you were invited to, and we still extend that invitation because as per the 3 motions in Coonamble, which we unanimously voted on by 420 people in the room, and I draw particular attention to motion number 3, which the Great Artesian Basin is too precious, so the pipeline will be stopped at all costs. So for me, when you send me pieces of paper, I will not open them, I will put them in the garbage bin because I will stand very firmly on the fact that I own the land and I'm not giving you permission to be on it. And from that, I think you should attend Saturday so you're under no misunderstanding about the vehement opposition of this whole project and that it will be stopped.
And I assume that was a statement, David, you didn't need a question answered there. Okay, sorry, so timelines, have you gone that stage? If you had to do compulsory processes, the timelines associated with that, Jim?
No, look, other than it would be a lengthy process, I haven't, we don't have a schedule that says it will take this many months or anything like that. Our entire focus is on negotiating with as many landowners as are willing to meet with us and seeking to reach as many agreements along the alignment as we can.
Thanks, Jim. We've got a few people lined up there, so I'm going to get back to you.
Sorry, Jim, I'm still stuck on this trespass and your misunderstanding of what trespass is. If you've been told no and you've got nothing signed, Angela Catt from Department said you actually have to make verbal or written communication with the owner to indicate their biosecurity, whatever they require on the farm. And so if you haven't got that, so you never rang Ferg, you never rang anyone else that went on, and then you come on and you bring on biomatter. So in one of the cases of your trespass, you brought on hay and carrots, or your subcontractors. I'm sorry, why is that not trespass, and why is that not then a biosecurity matter for the farmer whose farm that is?
So I will refer again to my comments in relation to our compliance with the authority to survey, in terms of notification of landowners and requesting them to outline their reasonable requirements regarding access, including matters such as biodiversity, preferred access routes and the like. Where a landowner hasn't communicated that to us, we have continued to undertake that survey in accordance with our own risk assessment.
Thanks. And look, this sounds like there is a major issue there with trespass, but I want to keep moving on and cover as many topics as we can.
Matt, just one other point on the legal advice that David raised. Our firm view in relation to the advice that's being relied on to this matter is that people are being misled by advice which is not correct and is putting them in a position where they're potentially undertaking actions that actually cross a line themselves. So what I would say to people is don't rely on the opinion that's out there necessarily. Seek your own advice. If you want to negotiate with APA, Paul's outline.
So, Jim, I'll come back to this. It's obviously a hot issue, but I want to just try and cover a few more issues, but I'll come back. That's right, David? Okay, right.
While we're on topic, Liz, the advice, you think that we're misinformed, and we very strongly believe you are misinformed, because the Pipeline Act is extremely clear. Your departments and your boffins won't produce to our solicitor the advice, so it can't even be discussed. On the issue of trespass on Ferg's Place, we aren't, for some miraculous reason, able to get the names from the police. They were provided to the police, but not to us. So now we've been told to go through a GIPA process to get that advice. It's all very suspicious.
Oh, thanks, David. I'll move down the back. I'll get this lady who's been waiting her turn.
Hello, Sandra Loftus. Some might know me as Peckham. I'm a local Wiradjuri woman from this area. I'm representing this area. So with the cultural impact study, who have you gone through? What organisation? Because we're a corporation out here. Did you go through ORIC to check what corporations are here?
Absolutely.
Well, you didn't contact us. That's why I'm here. I'm an hour late because I work in Peak Hill. Sure. Live out Dandaloo. Sure. Our boundaries, they're not like your boundaries or property boundaries. Our boundaries go 100 k's radius. We consult with Ningen, Narromine, Trangie. Every now and then Condo. I've only heard Condo mentioned in all this. So who and what group are you getting to do the cultural heritage impact studies?
Sure. So we have there's a number of parts to the question. First of all, we have an archaeological consultant undertaking.
What I've read in this is that your archaeologist is walking it. So he's the expert on country.
So there's been traditional owner representation as part of those surveys. I think all but on one property. So the vast majority of that 270 kilometres has had traditional owner participation in those surveys. The consultation process for Aboriginal cultural heritage is very specific in New South Wales in terms of what a proponent's required to do. So that has entailed letters to organisations such as ORIC and as to the NNTT and NDS Corp and all of the local Aboriginal land councils along the alignment, seeking them to nominate Aboriginal parties which may have an interest in the project, and that was a relatively long list of individuals and organisations that may have an interest. Based on that list, we're then required to seek from them an expression of interest in whether they wish to become a registered Aboriginal party for the project. In total, I think we have 54. I think I've previously said 55, but I was incorrect. There's 54 registered Aboriginal parties for this project. The guidelines dictate exactly what we need to do in terms of consulting with those registered Aboriginal parties. Again, in the material I've handed out today, the 4-page leaflet, there's a reference there that we recognise that there are people who may not have been aware of or have come to the project late in terms of their knowledge of it. In those instances, we'd be more than happy to engage with you and seek your feedback regarding the project. It's not too late to do that, and we'd be happy to do so.
Just one more question. And if anything is found out there, artefacts and that, what's going to happen to them?
So at this survey stage, nothing. They are left in situ and they documented and recorded in accordance with the code for archaeological practice in New South Wales. In relation to if there is an impact which cannot be avoided, and first and foremost the strategy is to avoid impact on identified sites. If that's not possible, then whether it's salvage of that material or otherwise is something that's consulted with the registered Aboriginal parties.
Thanks, Jim.
Doug Storer again. Are there opportunities for communities along the pipeline to utilise gas via off-takes to the pipeline? And if so, which communities, and can APA guarantee this in writing?
Look, I mean, it's a good question. Probably I'll start by saying, as you're probably well aware from your comments, APA doesn't own the gas. We're a transportation company. Moving on to the next situation, we would love to be able to find an economically acceptable situation where gas pipeline infrastructure could be delivered to users along the route. To that end, there has been some high-level assessment of the towns proximate to the route to see how many people live there, what sort of gas use they might have for heating and for hot water and room heating and those sorts of things. We've certainly looked at some of the big industry. We've started a program, as Jim's probably indicated to you. He's been very busy with the EIS. We do want to look at do cotton gins stack up? Are there feedlots, other sort of industrial type users of gas that might be able to be serviced. We're also going to look at and investigate, I guess, the market load, as we call it. Who is within 50 kilometres that might use stationary engines for pumping and the like, or heating, and to see whether compressed natural gas solutions might be able to deliver gas to those. So we're certainly keen on it. We would encourage anyone in this region who thinks that they may have it, or who are a large energy user, who may think that gas could be an option, to talk. We can't commit Santos to gas, but Santos, of course, would be keen, I think, to sell any gas they have. So we'll report on the progress of some of these considerations in the EIS. It doesn't necessarily stop just at an EIS type level. That's a standing offer. And I think, the hard thing we've got at the moment is knowing exactly who has what. It's quite easy to look at the cotton gins and understand roughly by the size of their gas bullets what their load may be. But we're keen to hear from industry.
Just a quick follow-up there.
So when will that information that people will be, of the people who are receiving the gas, be available for the public?
Okay, so I just need to be clear, we're going to do an investigation of whether there are customers who would want to buy the quantities of gas that were needed to underpin the infrastructure. So I think we'll give an update report in our EIS in 2 or so months' time about the sorts of market study work we've done and the sorts of things that we think could work. We'll be very blunt and say, taking a pipeline for 30 kilometres to run a house is never going to stack up. I think you probably all would understand that. So what we're looking for is basically industrial-sized loads. And that, as we get further south on this alignment, there's a few mining opportunities around the place. I know we've had 1 or 2 discussions with mines. We'll continue to engage with industry. But again, you'd know better than us who's got huge pumps, who's drying grain, who uses large quantities of liquid or current trucked gas fuel.
Thanks, Paul. Just jump down the front here again.
Yeah. I've been sitting here thinking that you blokes have got a job to do and you're battling through it pretty well. And then we touched on the trespass issue, and we've heard Jim talk about the legislation that enables them to do that. We've heard about carrots and hay, but I don't think, as a company, you've got any idea what you'll do to, in a confrontational situation, climb and lock gates, and you haven't denied it, and you haven't ruled it out ever happening again, but it's a stupid position to take. It just makes no sense at all to inflame a situation. If the gate's locked and you're meant to be on the other side of it, we'll stay on the other side of it. If that's too hard to take on, then the result of the next action that happens is you put your staff, your contractors in danger, and the farmer in danger. And when it's not carrots and hay I'm talking about, you put all those people at risk, and sure, you might have a mitigation factor later on, but it doesn't help the situation where you've created, and we don't want to go there. So I'm just going to make that point. Rule it out, because it is stupid behaviour, and I haven't heard anything said today up there about the trespass issue that doesn't rule out stupid behaviour.
Yeah. Look, and I think it's a point that's been well and exhaustively covered. I think the threshold issue is we believe in the validity of the ATS and the activities. Others don't. We accept that, but we would, as Jim said, suggest we all continue to look at legal advice around that, and obviously the department has made their point clear. I will also say that we operate nationally. Every state we operate in has similar provisions, whether it's called an ATS or a pipeline survey licence or other. It's a common thing, and I think it gets back to that whole situation of what linear infrastructure industry can survive if everything stops when just one person says no.
I don't mind that, but you want to rule out crazy actions on your part. You all get frustrated, we get frustrated in our job, and if you put it head to head, then who's responsible for that?
Yeah, look, and we don't like the circumstance of confrontation, I guess, and this might be, I think we can look at that 2 ways. We either work through the specified.
We'll let
No,
Paul
but-
have the chance to
but
answer.
I guess what I'm saying here is, and I take your point's well made, our activities could be viewed as confrontational and there can be confrontational results.
Well, we'll just go back a step there.
Look, and I think probably one question that was asked there before, what's our definition of trespass? Our definition of trespass is going onto a property where we haven't got a written agreement of a landowner, or we don't have a valid authority to survey, and where we haven't provided the notifications of that that are required by the ATS. Again, it's a threshold issue. If you don't believe in the ATS, you'll continue to call it trespass. We don't see it that way. But what I would say is, and I think hopefully it's become clear through this, the EIS is determined by government. ATSs are determined by government. Compulsory acquisition is a government step. And I think if we all want to avoid confrontation, what we would ask is that people, we're happy to acknowledge your objection to the project, but, the laws available there for things to be done so that EISs can be considered. And I think, we understand people don't like it, but working with us around rules on an ATS, on supervision through the ATS, etc., would certainly lessen the risk of that to all of us being a problem.
No, thanks. And we'll try and move on from trespass. It is an emotive issue, I think, trespass. I'll come back to this young lady in the middle here.
Yes, my name is Kerry Hannigan. My question's to you, Jim. Earlier on, someone asked about how many kilometres had been surveyed. You said you weren't sure. I think I saw on the newsletter or somewhere it was 270, and then a moment ago, Sandra, was it, asked about the cultural studies, I've forgotten exactly the term you used, but I think whatever cultural study you had done, you quoted the figure 270. Yep. I'm just wondering, is that physical kilometres that you have had some Indigenous person, or with the surveys, when you say 270 kilometres, is that physically on someone's place, or are you saying you've surveyed some of that by air or from other means?
No, I'm confident that, and 270 is the figure, I just couldn't recall it before, 270 kilometres of cultural heritage survey I think is the highest penetration of activity in terms of the number of sites that were covered.
So you've walked 270 kilometres on people's places, because I've done a lot of work on speaking to the landowners along the 460 kilometres and the neighbours, and have charted the maps and exactly how many kilometres are going through everybody's places, and have a fairly clear idea of who has given access and who hasn't, and I would dispute that figure greatly.
So the easiest way for me to respond to that is that the EIS that will be lodged will have maps attached to it which will show exactly where that survey has been undertaken.
Thanks, Jim. We've got Fergus again.
All right, just a final point. I know you believe in your authority, but you're actually not acting within the guidelines of the authority, not having identification. You couldn't show me any paperwork. As I said, you put those police in the situation where they had to lie to us, and they also got in a situation when they went on to get the identification of the workers, and they haven't, they said they'd give us that information and they haven't. So you could sort of theoretically say they've trespassed now, the police, because they haven't, stuck to their obligations of giving us that information of the trespassers.
So there's a response in writing in the brochure to each and every one of the points. And in relation to the court order point, we made it very clear that at no stage on that day did anyone from APA say we had a court order.
Thanks, Jim. So
it was not the place to have a debate about terminology for Tom.
Well, I think we can go back and forth on this.
I made that clear to the police on the day.
Jim, I think we can go back and forth on this a long time, and it's obviously a very emotive issue, but I'm keen to just hear a range of views. Just for people who put their hand up, I've got two here, and then I've got a young lady over there, and then I've got two back here, and three now. So I'll just keep going through these. Thanks.
Yeah, Adam McRae again, Canamble. Just with respect, and if I can speak on behalf of Indigenous people right along the pipeline. I mean, I am no expert, but I'm fairly aware of the fact that they really liked waterways. So that's where a lot of their inhabitants, or just where they hung out, where they met, where they lived. And if you're missing a big chunk of a couple of those waterways, how can you possibly stand by the information provided in that to submit that EIS? It's totally invalid.
Was it a
Sorry. Sorry.
I guess in terms of waterways in particular, where we haven't surveyed a waterway, we will be committing to do a survey before any disturbance occurs after submission of the EIS. And in relation to the avoidance principle that I mentioned before, there are a range of construction techniques available to us in order to avoid impacts. It tends to be the case that the types of artefacts that are associated with waterways are things like artefact scatters in vicinity of the waterway, scar trees and the like. We have the ability, particularly for major rivers, to do HDD, so horizontal directional drilling, where we can drill under and we can set back the entry and exit points to get away from the most sensitive zones in relation to those rivers. So they're the type of solutions that we'll be putting forward in the EIS. And look, I'm confident in the assessment that's been done of the cultural heritage matters for the project.
Thanks, Dave. Back to Chad.
Just following on from that, I'm really curious because I'm very much confident that when Kerry says that you've obviously trespassed over a great deal of the pipeline, but more importantly with Sandra's comments, if you haven't been through her and she's involved with obviously the local Lands Council, yeah, so she hasn't been contacted down at this end. I've been around and seen BJ Harris and JJ Robinson at Coonamble, and we've had a good long chat about that. The only contact you've had with them was half an hour back in, or sometime last year, and it got rained out. And other than that, you've had no contact with them. Can't find anyone in our local Aboriginal community that has had contact with you. So how the hell are you doing these cultural things? How are you inspecting these river courses when people like myself and McRae's and everybody else in the room that won't give you access? I think you're right out of line. But how have you done that surveying when this end hasn't given you any assistance, that end hasn't been approached? How the hell have you got it all?
Look, perhaps I'll come back to partly answer your question by going back to Kerry's point. Look, there have been just over half of the landowners along the alignment that have allowed access to occur for survey purposes. Contemplate for a minute that not all of those landowners may be willing to share with you and others the fact that they've allowed that survey to occur. There's a number of instances where people have communicated that to us.
I think, thanks Jim, I think that covers that. I've just got a question over here again.
Sorry, I'm jumping to a different question here. Is that okay? Landowner forums. I just noticed that directly affected landholders will be invited to discuss matters specifically relevant to them in group settings. 4 meetings will be scheduled between the 19th of February to the 22nd at various locations along the proposed pipeline route. With that point, I just have a couple of concerns, and that is directly affected landholders. So that means neighbours won't be invited to the meeting, even though they may not be directly affected at that time. In future, they might be, should you sell the property, etc. I also haven't been notified of any of these scheduled meetings as a landholder, and time's running out, 19th to the 22nd, it's approaching really close. Can you tell me where and when they might happen?
Absolutely. The landowner forums are scheduled for 2 weeks from this week, 19th through 22nd. Louise, if you haven't received an invite, please talk to me afterwards and I'll make sure that one's emailed to you straight away. A mail out was done to landowners last week in relation to all of those. You should have also received, Louise, and apologies if you haven't, the members of the CCC were also invited to attend through their role as members of the CCC. People can say what they want about that being divide and conquer and us looking to meet with people in smaller groups. What the commitment that APA is making is that we'll provide a range of forums in different settings for people to meet with us in a setting that they are comfortable with. That's why we're holding these meetings, to allow everyone to attend together. We also understand that some people don't like to meet in that setting, would prefer to meet one-on-one, and to date we've met with, I think, 70-odd landowners along the entire alignment. Now, not all of those are supportive of the project. Some of you in this room we've met with. Look, more than anything, we'll provide a number of different forums that provide an avenue for people to meet with this in a setting that they're comfortable with, whether that's as a community, in a setting such as this, or with their neighbours who are also affected by the pipeline, or one-on-one.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, look, I'd just like to say, apparently now it's natural gas and not coal seam. It seems that you blokes are fighting real hard to get into the Pilliga. And you'll say it's not your job. Your job's to build the pipeline. You get into the Pilliga and that gas comes out and depletes and or contaminates that Great Artesian Basin that so many of us depend on, Australians and the future generations will. Why don't you go and have a meeting with Santos, you're intelligent people, and go somewhere where you don't have to go through aquifers and risk that contamination and or depletion of that water?
You're right, it is Santos's job, not ours. We have a job which is transporting gas. We transport gas that meets a specific standard. And in relation to natural gas, coal seam gas refers to where it comes from and how it's processed, but once it's out of the ground, it's the same as methane from conventional sources. In relation to the Santos matters, I'd encourage you to communicate that through Santos, as well as through the, obviously many of you probably have the submission process that's already occurred. We as a company, look, we rely on the process that's in place there to assess that project in terms of its adequacy and its ability to manage the impacts associated with it, particularly on groundwater.
Thanks, Jim. Just jump up here.
Oh, yeah, Simon again. Look, Jim, quite sincerely, I do admire you for the job you've done. Because, like, you know, you've got a tough job. I thought I've done some dirty jobs, and I reckon you're doing a good one. But you know, and it would be inappropriate. I'd like to sort of plead with you and say, look, how many kids do you have? But that's a private question. I'm not going to ask you that. I'm not going to ask you about. But I know I've got 4. And at the end of a dirty day, like a day when I felt like sometimes like crying just from exhaustion, you know, I've only got to spend a moment with my children in my arms, you know, and that turns everything around. And for me, the issue is not just the pipeline, but also the coal seam gas and the extraction in the Pilliga. My 4 children were all bathed in bore water at night. I know every child in my town of Warren is bathed in bore water at night. Probably, I don't know where everyone else's bath water comes from, but that troubles me that if that water gets contaminated, just like my father-in-law that died of asbestosis, it was a wonderful product. You know, there was no problem. And so where do we don't live in the Pilliga, we don't have a real good hold over there. So it's not a personal thing. I have some real issues with the pipeline coming through, particularly through the Macquarie River just near me, but where can I resist a potentially thing that's going to endanger our children and contaminate them before we know about it? When are we going to? Where can we fight that? Where can we say no to Santos, except that you've got to bear the brunt of it? You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
So thank you for turning up. Thanks for trying.
Probably didn't realise it was going to be so hard when I signed up, to be honest. But, no, look, in terms of the Santos project and the potential impacts of it, you know, when I go to bed at night and sleep at night, the things that I look to is reliance on the process and confidence in the expertise of the people that are undertaking that process. I know the guys that are working at Santos, I've worked with them before, they're good people as well, and they know what they're doing, and you know, above all, I guess there's a process there, and I would say it's the most rigorous assessment process that's ever been applied to a project of that nature in the country. So, you know, I look to that stuff.
All right, thanks, Jim. Just got a couple more here and then up the front again.
Doug Storer again. Coal seam gas is far from natural gas, even though we end up with the same product in the end. Why does the APA website say the pipe will carry natural gas and not coal seam gas? And can this be corrected on your website?
Look, I think that's a definition which we can both be right. I mean, coal seam gas comes out of coal, which is natural. For us, gas meets the Australian gas standard. I think it's just semantics of definition. I think we all know where it comes from in the case that Narrabri goes ahead. APA transports any gas that meets the Australian standard. So we don't think it necessarily needs correction. You know, some of the gas that we transport does currently come from coal seam. It is all natural gas as opposed to an LPG type gas, and I think that's the distinction that our customers and the market would be looking for to understand what are we transporting, essentially methane.
Thanks, Paul. Just about the back here.
G'day, Tom Walker again. I entered into this as a negotiation under good faith. And I don't have a problem with with some of the advice I've had. I think it's been more than upfront, and I don't mind that at all. What really disappoints me is that it hasn't been a negotiation. A lot of this is a done deal. You've had advice on all sorts of things about insurance, and you seem to palm them off as being someone's being petty, or it's a non-issue, or they're just being obstructionist and it's not a legitimate issue. There are a lot of people here that have very legitimate problems with this pipeline, and that's a separate thing to the gas, but I'm just saying the legitimate issues with the pipeline, and you're not giving them any validity whatsoever. You can say you have confidence in the process. We don't. We don't have confidence in the process because we get misleading information. And some of the information you've said, Jim, to me, to be quite honest, I find misleading. Now, maybe that's intentional, maybe it's accidental, but that's what's happened. So, in the interests of trying to be upfront and trying to have a proper negotiation, please try and take on board what people are telling you. Not everyone is just trying to be a pain in the arse. People have real concerns. Try and put yourself in their position. And you might understand that they're not just trying to be a pain in the arse or a problem or being obstructionist. They might actually have legitimate things, and you should bloody well listen. Otherwise, it's not a negotiation. It's just a rubber stamp thing. You're going through an exercise, you tick a box, and that's it. There are real people, real lives, real concerns. Give it some legitimacy, the process.
Thanks. And I'd take that probably as a statement, Paul, more than anything else, unless you want to address something in particular.
Look, we're prepared to meet on specific issues that landowners have and get into the detail. I think we've offered here today for people to work with us and expert advice to go through these. I think at the moment a lot of people are wanting us to give all of the answers for what are specific landowner issues, and that's very hard to do. We can deal with any issue that people want to understand more about the pipeline, how they can be compensated, what the risks are and how they can be managed. It's very hard to us to do that if people won't sit down and talk to us. We acknowledge some people have a philosophical objection to this pipeline based on coal seam and other matters there. We accept that. We would like to be able to work with you and deal with the things we can deal with. And you know, we are negotiating in good faith, Tom. It's a big challenge. We have some people who are, as Jim said, sitting down and talking with us. We're making great progress. For others, I think a few people are sort of sitting at the starting gates, not knowing whether they should or shouldn't or how to enter, and others have clearly stated their position. We will work with everyone in good faith. There's lots that can be done, and like all problems, sitting down and actually talking about them and getting the right advice, you know, is the pathway to seeing whether we can get somewhere. So we stand by that.
Thanks, Paul. Brian?
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, Brian Plummer. There was a question David asked earlier, just briefly, he never got an answer to because he was talking about the invitation to you guys on Saturday at Coonamble, and I don't think you got a response, did you, David, whether you guys are actually going to that meeting?
Now, look, we have written back. You may not have received it. I can't remember who the letter specifically came from, but we have responded. We think we have extended this community forum, the one tomorrow in Coonamble. We understand the Great Artesian Base Protection Group's position. I think it's come out again here tonight. You're anti the project. So we don't think we're going to add anything in particular to that value given the agenda you've set forward. We see this and tomorrow and possibly subsequent sessions like this as the way for community members of the Coonamble district to engage with us.
Okay, no, I'd like to reinforce what Tom said there a minute ago actually, because I've just had a bit gutful of these so-called public consultations. People come here in good faith, take the time off work. The take-home message I'm getting clear from you today, Paul, is that you guys think you've got the legal rights, somehow or other the moral rights, and we can just take it, Jack, because you're not taking on board the general opposition to it, full stop. So everything else is peripheral. If we're saying no, everything else is peripheral, but you don't seem to have any capacity in this process to take that on board. All we're hearing is sort of side deflection, move on. So in the essence of clarity, there's been statements here about statistics of the pipeline length. I'd just like to make it clear that it has grown. I've done a quick assessment here, and I think it's now out to about 515 k's to get around the Five Ways region. Thank you very much. The answer's no.
Thanks, Brian. I've just got a question down the back, then back up the front, then two in the middle here. And then, Tom, you're fifth on that list.
Thank you. Yeah, Jim, a few questions ago when Doug said the difference between coal seam gas and natural gas, yeah, on the face of it, it looks like semantics. Sorry, I did want to speak about it right then, but obviously there are a lot of other people who want to speak. It seems like it, but, you know, words can be twisted very nicely. Like we all know, come on, natural gas, it sounds good, doesn't it? Coal seam gas, got a bit of a nasty reputation. Sorry, yeah, maybe it's semantics. Maybe that's a clever word, but there is a hell of a lot of difference between the two, okay? Now, I just think we're winding up soon. I just come back what was said down the front a minute ago. You know, we've been here a hell of a long while. Most of us plan to stay here for a long while. And whether it's us or someone else who buys our properties, whatever, in the future, there'll be someone farming out here, allowing for the climate, doing the right thing by us, for maybe thousands of years. Certainly there's no reason why you couldn't. I tell you what, that pipeline will be, we know, you know, it's a short-term project, and it's it's long-term pain for short-term gain, really, putting that round the other way. You know, and you could, as has been said here, and I know that's not your issue, it's nothing to do with you, it's Santos, but you could just wreck that artesian basin and our water, and then we all go out of business. So you're looking at one industry that might go for a short time comparing to an industry that will go on pretty much as long as, you know, as there are people that will be willing to live out here. I don't think there's any contest. I think farming wins.
Again, I'll take that as a statement. You didn't need a question answered out of that? No. Right, thanks. Just got down the front here and I've got two in the middle.
There was an apology from Austin McDowell, who couldn't come down to the meeting today, and he asked that I read this letter with the questions attached to that. He received correspondence from APA in response to concerns that he raised about the major impacts to their shallow underground water streams and the blowout section of the E2 Creek in flood times. The pipeline alignment is going through these very sensitive areas, and the reply from you guys was that the design and construction methods can be implemented to address the concerns and you'd like to meet. But then in the middle of this correspondence there was a disclaimer, and it says, quote, "Views expressed are those of the author and not APA. APA does not guarantee nor accept liability for the reliability, completeness or confidentiality, etc., etc." So Austin's question is, does any of the information or answers to people's questions here today only represent you three guys, the speakers, and not APA? And how can we have any trust in any answers or any undertakings given?
So I'll answer that in two parts. First of all, the second part, we speak for APA, and there's no doubt about that. In relation to the matters that you referred to in terms of the correspondence to Austin, that was correspondence between two lawyers. And I believe what you've read there is a typical legal disclaimer. It is not in any way meant to, I guess, discredit the nature of the commitment that we've made to Austin, that we're more than happy to work with him to understand better the shallow groundwater issues that occur in that region. They are known, it is a known environmental, I guess, issue in that area in terms of shallow groundwater, commonly referred to as sand monkeys. Through that Pilliga outwash region. Our water consultant that's doing work on our EIS at the moment is addressing that issue quite specifically and to a level of detail. But yeah, I reiterate what's in the letter in terms of our willingness to talk to Austin further about that and provide him input into the work that we're doing at the moment.
Thanks, Jim. Just in the middle here.
Yes, it's Brian Hannigan from Campbell. In light of the fact that you've come here and been able to inform us and fill us with a heck of a lot of confidence about how this project's going to go ahead, And so there isn't any misunderstanding about how this community meeting has gone today. I'd just like a quick show of hands as to who really is totally for this project or has been happy with how the proceedings have gone today, because if it gets reported through the media that you've had this successful meeting, yes, you've had a meeting, but successful, well, there's an interpretation there.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll move it to David there.
Who's against, after all this discussion, who else is still against this project? Against the project.
Brian, I wouldn't expect that anyone wants this on their property. People would prefer it doesn't exist. So I wouldn't expect anyone to put their hand up and say, yeah, I'll have a pipeline, great. It's natural that everyone would prefer that it wasn't there. Our commitment is that for those properties where we are proposing to put the pipeline, that we'll work with you to do everything we can to minimise the impact that it has.
Thanks, Jim. Back to David.
Just want to clarify your comment, Paul, about this meeting and tomorrow's meeting. The community, as per the 6th of December, and I would be very surprised if you haven't got those 3 motions. But the community is going to treat itself, and the community will be made up of the towns, the farmers and the Aboriginal community, to stay together and stand and say, this is what we're doing. It's not a big crowd here. I wouldn't expect a big crowd tomorrow because the meeting's been called for Saturday. And I'd ask you to reconsider, and will you attend the meeting on Saturday, because you will have the community together then for your interpretation.
I will, and maybe if I can just backtrack slightly there. We didn't come here to change people's mind about coal seam or pipelines. We came here to ensure that on specific issues where we think there's been some other people's interpretations floating around, that we were here to able to explain our point of view and hopefully to add some value to that. David, I think, we called a public meeting. We stand by our offer tomorrow for Coonamble or anyone in that vicinity who wants to attend. There's no caveats as to who attends. We understand your position, and we've seen a show of hands. We understand there's a portion of people around there. But I think you need to recognise that there are also people who are talking to us. So we will recognise you as a group, but we don't necessarily recognise you as the one spokesperson group for all of Coonamble. So we'll be at the meeting tomorrow. We wish you well for your session on Saturday. We don't think it will add any value for us to be told again that a selection of people don't like the pipeline and have severe concerns about aquifers. We fully understand that. We respect the point of view. We don't happen to necessarily agree that the pipeline can't be managed adequately, but we won't be there on Saturday.
Thanks, Paul. Back down to Tom down the back.
Paul, isn't that disappointing in that you're immediately making an assumption that everyone there is just going to be talking on behalf of a stated position that they have on gas? I mean, surely there are people, all the time there are people that are asking questions, and they're legitimate questions and they deserve answering. When I ask questions, and I ask them quite often on behalf of a whole heap of people, I'm immediately put down as, okay, well, this is only specific to your place. It's not. Most of the hydrology and water issues will affect a lot of people, it won't just be me. Most of the insurance issues, same thing, will affect a lot of people, not just me. I ask them on behalf of a lot of people, but you want to answer them and say, well, that's a specific negotiation between you and I. So that's not a way of addressing it. I still am disappointed that it comes back to credibility of information. You told me, I'll clear this up because it wasn't you, Paul, but I've been told along the way that the hydrology information available wasn't adequate. So there were studies being made, but that information wasn't available at this point in time. I've been told that the veg survey stuff wasn't sufficient to cover this area. It was by no means good enough, so there was going to be more work done on that. But you're saying, oh, it's fine. I've been told all sorts of things that I've been told about the ATS and they have these conditions and they're all great and it's all settled. And I asked for clarification. That's a legitimate thing. A lot of people wanted clarification. Now, to say that the department's posted something up on their website and then now it's clarified, I just don't get it. Everyone's meant to come and look at that website. I didn't even know it was available. Yes, I've been distracted lately, but I'm not the only one. So the conditions of the ODS, they haven't been clarified. They are legitimate concerns, and I just don't see how you can keep coming up with this thing saying, okay, well, everyone who's just saying stuff is out there because of an issue they have with gas. I have an issue with gas. I've been upfront about that. But the issues I have don't even start with the gas. My issues are with the pipeline. I thought you guys were a professional outfit. I assumed that you were. You were a major company. I assumed right from the outset when I said, okay, well, any desktop study will identify areas where there's a problem. Surely you will identify that. Surely they will address that. Instead of that, you've taken an approach that, okay, no, we're going to bulldoze our way through here and we will do little things and we'll compensate for this. But instead of that, at no stage did you say, well, maybe it's legitimate that there's an issue in that area. We'll avoid that. You didn't do that. All you've said is, oh, we'll negotiate with the individual landholder and we'll do a few things that might mitigate the problem as best we can. Simple way to avoid it is to avoid it. I just don't understand it.
I don't think there was a question there, was there, Tom?
No, I just asked Paul to respond.
Yeah, look, maybe, and there's obviously a lot in what you've said there, Tom, and I think you're talking at some macro levels and then some site-specific issues about your property, which we've spoken about at length. Now, I said there were two issues within there. Can I just say, though, Tom sits and is a great member of the CCC, the Southern CCC. If you look at the list of frequently answered questions that we thought would be on people's minds when we prepared information on the project, they have grown. Now, I'm not saying we're perfect, but as those questions are raised through CCC or other forums, or we're getting correspondence and the like, we are trying to expand them. They now run to multiple pages. So we are trying to put that information out there and give comfort about it. So, you know, we can always do better, we can always communicate more, but I don't think we can sit there and say we've just stuck to one song, because we have given more and more information and we're prepared to. But on a lot of the issues that you're talking about, you know, whether it's the validity of an ATS, we are struggling a bit more as to what we can do, as to whether or not we believe the government or some other lawyer. Our experience is that governments give ATSs or similar in other jurisdictions, and that they're reliable. That's our discussions with the department. So we understand people may like that, but I don't think we can sit there and say we haven't responded, because we have.
Thanks, Paul. Kate?
Okay, you could easily take on board then, if you wish to improve your community consultation, you could go to Coonamble. Secondly, if you wish to improve your community consultation, you won't rely on towns that have no newspaper, rely on putting stuff on websites when a lot of people don't actually have good internet service. There is nothing about this meeting on any social media pages that you have posted. So the local community people, not in our area there isn't. There is, so the local community in Warren, for example, the people in the town, etc., that don't read the newspaper, that don't get your direct invitation, they don't know anything about this. So that's not engaging in the wider community. That's part of, it might have been over your part of the world of the wireless, it was not in the Warren.
So you don't do 2CR?
No, we don't listen to 2CR, no. Sorry, mate.
Thanks, Kate. I'll move over here to this gentleman again.
I've been listening to you fellas, and I've heard terms of working with and respect, and I'm just wondering when you guys are actually going to front up with the honesty and the stones to say, well, we actually don't care what you think, we're going to bulldoze our way in, and we don't care, and this is just ticking a box.
Thanks. Now, this was, for the people that saw it, it was advertised from 5 till 7. I'm sure APA staff are happy to keep going as long as we like. I'm conscious of people's lives as well that we're impacting. But so, are there any? You just said you're done, but I'll just make sure we've got no more questions here. So, again, with your permission, I'm sure you're happy to keep taking questions into late hours of the night. So, if there are any more questions with issues that haven't been brought up, or issues that you want to bring up or add to what's there, then we'll keep taking them. But again, I am conscious of people's times and the impact on your lives. We've got one more question in here, but any more questions, we'll take those. Otherwise, we'll wrap up the meeting fairly soon.
I'm just going to do a sum up on behalf of our community here, is that we believe that we're not going to negotiate, and we believe you've destroyed your social licence to operate in our area, and that our community holds with the Coonamble motions. We're not going to be meeting with you in little landholder forums where you can try and divide and conquer us like you did to George Bender in Queensland. And so we aren't going to be doing that. We're going to uphold the motions. We're going to block the peer legal progress, and we will block this pipeline at any cost. And we just need to make you very aware you're going to have serious resistance, okay?
Well, no more questions? Okay, thank you. I mean, a gentleman down here said before it hasn't been successful. From my perspective, I think it's been great that people have been able to have their say, the people have brought their points forward, and I think incredibly well behaved. I mean, with emotional issues like this, it's easy for people to let the emotion get carried away, but I think everyone here has been, and thank you because it made my job easier, has been very factual, has stated the facts, has actually got the information across there, and then given the APA representatives a chance to actually answer those. And I appreciate the APA representatives, because it's obviously tough to come out where you know there's going to be opposition, but they've stood here, they've answered the questions, they've gone through. So thank you to everyone in the audience, thank you to the APA representatives. I'm sure there'll be a lot more on this, and I'm intrigued to see where it goes next. Thank you.